Chapter 169, Fierce Battle 3. Han Li's and senior martial brother Lu's magic power was steadily being absorbed into the sword talisman and the Azure Flood Dragon banner. Both their bodies and minds were focused on their struggle. They didn't dare to be careless or negligent in the slightest. Neither of them held any effort or magic power in reserve to prevent the other from overwhelming them. They both clearly understood that the slightest carelessness on either side would cause them to immediately lose their life along with the treasure. There was no longer a path for retreat. Thus, the struggle between the Azure Flood Dragon and the huge sword unexpectedly developed into a battle of attrition to see whose magic power would be exhausted first. When the two realized that the quantity of their remaining magic power was the crucial point of the battle, they both took action to increase their own spiritual power. They took out spirit stones and held them in their hand to absorb their magic power. However, senior martial brother Lu had a low-grade wind attribute spirit stone, while Han Li had a mid-grade earth attribute spirit stone. This discovery caused senior martial brother Lu's complexion to become unsightly, and he became exceptionally frightened and alarmed. A Qi condensation disciple unexpectedly possessed a mid-grade spirit stone that only sect cultivators at Foundation establishment or higher could obtain. This greatly surprised him, as it was widely known that mid-grade spirit stones replenish spiritual power far faster than low-grade spirit stones. In terms of replenishing spiritual power, he was at a great disadvantage. Regardless, senior martial brother thought better of it. His magic power was already much deeper than his opponent's. Even if his opponent replenished his magic power faster than he did, he wouldn't be able to persist for long. After all, the little bit of magic power that was replenished would be consumed at the same rate as it was used. It was truly insignificant. With this thought, senior martial brother Lu calmed down and concentrated. But when senior martial brother Lu saw Han Li's next action, senior martial brother Lu's expression changed once more to an appearance of disbelief and amazement. Han Li voluntarily removed his blue protective barrier in front of senior martial brother Lu and openly revealed his true body. Although senior martial brother Lu was outstandingly intelligent, his opponent's actions caused his mind to be in a state of confusion. He did not know what Han Li was thinking. Could it be that Han Li was no longer worried that his wind blades could take his life? Senior martial brother Lu's thoughts surged several times throughout his mind, but did not hesitate for long. He decisively extended his left hand toward the sky and formed a faint azure wind blade. However, Han Li did not wait for senior martial brother Lu to finish condensing his wind blade and flung his arm toward the opponent. The huge sword, rigidly tangled with the Azure Flood Dragon, suddenly resonated with great radiance. Han Li actually took advantage of his preoccupation with the wind blade to suddenly shake off the Azure Flood Dragon and shot straight towards senior martial brother Lu. In this short moment, senior martial brother Lu was startled and frightened by no small amount. If he persisted in forming the wind blade and attempted to launch it, he may be able to take Han Li's life. But equivalently, the giant sword would execute him, and he was also certain to lose his life, ending both sides in mutual destruction. Although the wind wall had yet to dissipate, this huge sword was able to contend with the Azure Flood Dragon banner's transformation. That hurricane would certainly be easily destroyed by the huge sword and would be unable to obstruct it for even a fraction of a second. This senior martial brother Lu was unable to accept this outcome. He still had vast prospects and a beautiful future. He was simply unwilling to meet his end in the wilderness against this unknown person. With this in mind, he thought no further. He gave up on the wind blade and wildly channeled all of his magic power toward the Azure Flood Dragon and summoned it toward him. That Azure Flood Dragon banner was truly an amazing wind attribute magic tool. With the entirety of senior martial brother Lu's strength, it met Han Li's huge sword halfway and once again entered a struggle. Seeing this, senior martial brother Lu let out a sigh of relief, his body covered in cold sweat. Thus, in the following period of time, senior martial brother Lu attempted to cast magic techniques several more times, wanting to attack Han Li. However, Han Li used the same technique every time, forcing him to withdraw. Although Han Li hadn't the least bit of protection, he was unable to act against him. Senior martial brother Lu was incomparably sullen and was forced to rely on his deeper magic power, thereby continuing to deplete it. At this moment, Han Li took out various small herbs and such from his storage pouch and stuffed them into his mouth. As he chewed the large mouthfuls, senior martial brother Lu was dumbstruck. he didn't know what other sinister plot his opponent was planning. He could not guess what his opponent was planning and was baffled, causing senior martial brother Lu to feel bleak. He had a bad premonition. However, he cherished his life far too much. Although he was far more shrewd than normal people, he had been at his wits' end for a while. As more time passed by, senior martial brother Lu's heart gradually grew heavier. At last, the azure dragon's light began to dim, but the huge gray streak was as dazzling as before. Senior martial brother Lu could not help but be frightened. He shouted out hoarsely, "Impossible! My magic power far exceeds yours. Even if you've been replenished by a mid-grade spirit stone, it is impossible for you to currently have energy remaining. You should have exhausted your magic power before I did." Soon, the azure flood dragon was on the verge of collapse. Senior martial brother Lu yelled out. His shout was like the last bark of a wild dog that fell into a well full of objection. When Han Li saw his plan completely realized, he could not help but smile. After he heard the opponent's words, his mouth slightly slanted, causing his smile to become a sneer. He didn't have the leisure to explain all of this to a dead man, as killing him was the most urgent affair. He was also almost entirely out of magic power, so how could he afford to waste that effort on the enemy? With that thought, Han Li paid no attention to the opponent's question. He pointed at the huge sword, causing its radiance to become even more magnificent. It gradually whittled away at the azure flood dragon until it was only about 3 meters long. Its azure light was so dim that it could nearly no longer be seen. When senior martial brother saw this, he became completely desperate. Thus, the desire to stake it all rose in his heart, and his eyes gradually shone with madness. Without speaking, he gradually retrieved the little magic power remaining in the azure flood dragon banner, causing it to return to its original form in an instant and fall from the sky. Then, without regard for the huge sword rushing forth to execute him, he used his remaining magic power to condense a huge wind blade and ruthlessly throw it toward Han Li without the slightest hesitation. When Han Li saw this, his heart trembled. While the opponent rushed to throw the wind blade, he directed the huge sword to behead the opponent. Then, without staying to look at the aftermath, Han Li fled, already rushing out about 10 meters away. After previously receiving the wind blades, Han Li knew of their frightening speed. If he didn't immediately use shifting smoke steps to avoid it, he wouldn't be able to defend himself. He would have been caught unprepared and be cut into two, dying with grievances and unable to rest in peace. The wind blade was truly extraordinarily fast. It already reached the location where Han Li had just fled from. However, it unexpectedly followed the direction Han Li was fleeing in and fiercely shot out once more. Han Li did not think any further and used shifting smoke steps to its greatest extent. In a small area, he continuously shifted left and right, transforming into several afterimages, causing the wind blade that was closely chasing him to be unable to catch up. Han Li clearly understood that if he fled in a straight line, he would certainly be cut down by the wind blade. By using fine and delicate movements, he would be able to defend himself without worry. This was the reason why he dared to abandon his defensive magic technique. Pache. The wind blade suddenly lost control and disappeared into the earth, leaving a deep groove. Han Li let out a long breath. At this moment, he calmed his panicked heart. Using a movement technique from the mortal world to evade a cultivator's attack was truly a frightening affair. Han Li sat on the ground and then looked across from him. He saw that the wind wall had already disappeared and that senior martial Lu, who had been hiding behind it, was cut into 2 pieces. The 2-pieced corpse laid there motionlessly. Next to it was a huge sword with a dimming radiance. Chapter 170 Spoils of the Battle. Chapter 170 Spoils of the Battle. Han Li raised his hand and beckoned to the sky. That huge sword immediately turned its point and flew back. When it was in front of Han Li, it returned to its original talisman form and fell toward his hand like a light feather. Just as Han Li reached out his hand to the treasure talisman Zila, it turned to flames. A short moment later, it turned into a pile of ash and disappeared with the mountain wind. Seeing this, Han Li stood there expressionless. A moment later, he bitterly smiled. This treasure talisman could be considered utter scrap. Even at the start of the fight, it no longer had much power remaining. Too much time had passed in the close struggle, eventually consuming all of its power. This caused Han Li, who deeply knew of its value, to feel great heartache, but he could do nothing about it. After all, being able to kill a formidable enemy such as senior martial brother Lu did not come without cost. Regardless, the opponent's Azure Flood Dragon banner was actually quite an impressive loot. It was sufficient enough to make up for the loss of this treasure talisman, not to mention the 2 Foundation establishment pills he had yet to plunder. With this thought, Han Li could not help but burst with joy, feeling that this fierce battle had actually been worth something. If he could take these pills and succeed in reaching Foundation establishment, he wouldn't need to participate in braving the strange and dangerous trial of blood and fire. After all, the number of cultivations as strong as Senior Marshal Brother Lu was sure to be substantial. He feared there would be even quite a few cultivators who were even more troublesome. A moment later, Han Li was absorbing a spirit stone in his hand. After he recovered his magic power to some degree, he stood up, wanting to pick up the Azure Flood Dragon banner not far away from him. Just as Han Li straightened his back, an acute stab of pain came from his dantian, making it feel as if countless steel needles were suddenly stabbing into it. Han Li doubled over from the pain. His complexion was incomparably pale as he grimaced in pain. Han Li was motionless. After the time it took to brew a cup of tea, he took a deep breath and felt the pain slightly weaken. Han Li's expression was somewhat gloomy. The corner of his mouth twitched several times. As for why this was happening, he was well aware. The reason was the great amount of aged medicine herbs he had swallowed a moment ago. Although he was able to promptly absorb some of the herbs' spiritual power, much of it gathered at his dantian as foreign rejection. Mixed among this were many unclear medical impurities. If he didn't purify them in time, they were certain to cause no end of trouble. Although Han Li fully knew that swallowing the spiritual herbs was undesirable and certain to harm himself, he had done so to preserve his life. He had no better option but to take the risk and try. Sure enough, this method of forcefully absorbing spiritual qi had been of great help during the prolonged battle. However, just devouring medicine herbs was not enough to allow Han Li to persevere to the end. Apart from replenishing his spiritual power with the mid-grade spiritual stone to defeat the opponent, there was another crucial point contributing to his victory: the cancellation of his defensive magic technique, the water barrier technique. In the previous 2 years that he spent studying and practicing basic magic techniques, Han Li unexpectedly learned from Wu Feng that a majority of the low-level disciples had a misunderstanding over the use of talismans. They believed that apart from the spiritual power they used to activate the talisman, talismans did not further consume any of the user's power. In reality, the moment the talisman was activated, it continued to use a sliver of magic power from its connection to its user, allowing the user to conveniently control the magic technique. If the magic technique did not disappear, the user would continue to be drained of magic power to preserve the spiritual connection. Because qi condensation disciples were unable to see or interact with these sorts of spiritual threads, in addition to the minuscule amount of magic power used in the short term, a majority of the disciples overlooked this, resulting in false understandings. Although there were several disciples who knew the truth, they felt that this matter was insignificant. As a result, this information was not actively spread among low-level disciples. Wu Feng was one of those few who knew. When he told Han Li this during a casual chat, Han Li deliberately kept it in mind. After several personal tests later, he verified it to be true. As a result, in the middle of that fierce battle of attrition, Han Li remembered this and decisively revoked his defensive magic technique, saving quite a bit of magic power. Although it seemed to be a negligent amount at first, the magic power it would consume was not insignificant after a long period of time. Like that, Han Li relied on this bit of preserved magic power to persevere a bit longer against the opponent. Had he not relied on those 2 advantages, he might have not been the one who lasted longer. Thus, Han Li undoubtedly felt that this victory had been exceedingly dangerous to have exhausted all of his means simply to save his life. The opponent's strength was truly greater than his own. However, regardless of how the story was told, the one left alive was him. After Han Li felt this pain slightly lessen, he forced himself to stand and started to slowly move, eventually reaching where the Azure Flood Dragon banner had fallen down. He forced himself to pick up the magic tool and delightfully examined it before finally putting it away in his storage pouch. Then he walked over to Senior Marshal Brother Lu's corpse. After he looked at the extremely bloody scene with slight disgust, he waddled around to look for loot. His storage pouch was easily found on the upper half of the corpse. Han Li impolitely took out the items from the storage pouch and emptied them all out. Soon enough, he saw the case and bottle containing the Foundation establishment pills. Feeling elated, he could not help but look at these items. He hastily lowered his body to pick up the case and bottle. Then he opened them, finding a lustrous blue medicine pill in each container. Although the scent was somewhat pungent, the pills contained formidable spiritual power. Hanli wore a strong smile on his face. He was immediately certain that the Foundation establishment pills were genuine. Even so, he currently had no mind to look through the other goods. After all, this place was where a battle had just occurred. He did not stay there for long and hurried to slip away. Hanli swiftly put away the items and carefully concealed senior martial brother Lu's storage pouch. He felt a bit of relief and could not help but straighten out and stretch his body. At this moment, he heard the sound of wind behind him, as if something was charging over. Hanli was startled and immediately thought to escape, but he suddenly felt a violent burst of pain from his dantian, causing his body to suddenly become sluggish. Then a fragrant, smooth woman's body energetically embraced him from behind. Hanli was stunned and struggled to get free. However, because of the stabbing pain from his dantian and the fact that his limbs were lacking strength from having just fought, he could not free himself. Under these circumstances, although Hanli already faintly guessed the identity of the person behind him, he could not help but glance behind him. But just as he turned his head halfway, a beautiful and gentle face was already intimately pressed up against him and was incessantly using her sweet lips to madly kiss Hanli. As expected, it was Junior Martial Sister Chen, who originally could not move a single step. It turned out that this Junior Martial Sister Chen previously couldn't move because of the wind binding technique. However, Hanli and Senior Martial Brother Lu's battle didn't reach her location, so she was able to entirely avoid the battle while lying down. After the fight, she actually hadn't the slightest injury. Before the battle started, the effects of the joyful meeting pill had already flared out, causing Junior Martial Sister Chen to be delirious with a burning passion. Her eyes were filled with delusion, completely wanting to join together with another person. However, she was bound by a magic technique and was unable to budge in the slightest, still appearing quite innocent. But deep in her heart, she was tormented by greater and greater lustful desires. A moment ago, the wind-binding technique's effects expired and Junior Martial Sister Chen, who had just obtained her freedom, was brimming with the excitement of lust. Thus she instantly charged toward the sole male nearby, Hanli, and tensely embraced him. From above, this appeared to be an extremely romantic scene. However, Hanli was a genuine virgin. After the frenzy of kisses from Junior Martial Sister Chen, Hanli felt his mind shake as a peculiar feeling surged forth. Since Hanli had never flaunted himself as a gentleman of honor, Hanli did not feel it beneath him to experience having this woman in his lap. As a result, the passionate Hanli, with no trace of politeness, reached out from behind him and embraced Junior Martial Sister Chen. Feeling Hanli's response, Junior Martial Sister Chen felt even more unbearable. Although she never experienced the affair between males and females, her natural carnal instincts still caused her to begin to tear away at Hanli's clothes. Junior Martial Sister Chen's actions caused the infatuated Hanli to sober up. He didn't dare to tangle with fire once more, and hastily felt for a soul-lock talisman with his right hand. Then, with some difficulty, he aroused the few strands of magic power he had just recovered and used the soul-lock technique to restrain Junior Martial Sister Chen. Afterwards, he softly struggled to free himself of Junior Martial Sister Chen's alluring bosom and gently placed the woman on the ground. Chapter 171, Return. Chapter 171, Return. Hanli half-squatted next to Junior Martial Sister Chen in passing, and lowered his head to look carefully at the soft and captivating appearance of this lustful woman. That curvaceous, plump body had naughtily exposed the abdomen, even slightly exposing a few mysterious areas, causing Hanli to become dry at the mouth and grow somewhat dizzy. He clearly understood that so long as he wished, the extraordinary beauty before him would immediately allow him to experience ecstasy that would seep into his very bones and allow him to become a true man. But after he blankly looked for a long while, Hanli reluctantly shifted his eyes away, returning his gaze towards the woman's face. He wrinkled his brow and suddenly extended his forefinger toward her almond lips, softly wiping them. After he felt that moist smoothness, he quickly retracted his hand and softly sniffed it. It truly is the joyful meeting pill. It seems he didn't lie, Hanli said to himself. A short moment after, it seemed he completely regained calmness. Great beauty, it seems your luck is quite good. Had you consumed some other aphrodisiac, I fear I would have truly ended your life early. However, since it is the joyful meeting pill, I don't necessarily have to. It can be assumed that you have already sunk into a hallucination and fundamentally cannot remember my appearance. Han Li softly said as he lifted the woman's chin with his hand and looked into her beautiful, bewitching eyes. In truth, the safest method would be to have you to disappear from this world. After all, even if you are hallucinating, you still might have a somewhat indistinct impression. Although this probability is very low, you should rejoice. Even though I am not a good person, I am not so vicious and fond of killing. I am also soft-hearted towards women. If you were a man, I would have cut you down without hesitation. Han Li continued to talk to himself, helplessly and bitterly smiling. Once this was said, Han Li became silent for a moment. After rigidly staring at the woman's dainty appearance for a good while, he lowered his head and suddenly kissed the woman's beautifully soft and alluring almond lips. Feeling him somewhat clumsily sucking on her lips, the woman passionately responded. After a long moment of ecstasy, Han Li reluctantly parted with the woman's alluring lips. The affair between males and females is truly wonderful. Although I cannot truly experience ecstasy, this intimate mouthful could be considered a reward for the kindness of saving your life, Han Li muttered, appearing absolutely reluctant to suffer a loss. As for this woman's foundation establishment pill, because he had seized it from the hands of senior marshal brother Lu, Han Li would not return it. Sai, your current appearance can truly tempt men. Had I not heard from old man Ma that men and women who lose their virginity have a reduced chance at reaching foundation establishment, how could I possibly reject such a fine occasion and be forced to throw away my heart's desires? Han Li's complexion began to return to tranquility. However, he lightly shook his head, exposing a deeply regretful appearance. After all, between the pleasures of the night and the undertaking of cultivation, which was more important, Han Li immediately reined in his lust and cleared his mind. As for why that senior marshal brother Lu didn't mind drugging and raping this woman, Han Li didn't need to think deeply to arrive at a conclusion. Seeing such an outstanding pretty boy, he had probably lost his virginity long ago, so he had no qualms about doing so. As a result, lacking the confidence to attempt reaching foundation establishment and delaying in taking the foundation establishment pill, he convenienced Han Li. Since Han Li's decision was already set, he did not intend to waste any time. First, he used fireballs to smash a large hole not far away and threw senior marshal brother Lu's corpse inside. Then he burned the corpse to ashes and filled the hole until it was flat with dirt, thoroughly exterminating traces of the corpse. At the location of the battle, he felt that there were a few extremely distinct landmarks and used the long saber in his storage pouch to thoroughly slash and ruin the area, removing the slightest visible trail. Then, after he draped his own clothes on Junior Marshal Sister Chen, he carried her, hurriedly flying away from that place. After he flew west for more than 100 li, he found a rather large concealed cliff and descended. After he placed the woman down beneath the large rock, Han Li thought to immediately fly away, but he turned his head to glance at this woman's blushing appearance and couldn't help but sigh. Then he turned around and moved closer to Junior Marshal Sister Chen. He fished out a white porcelain bottle from his bosom and poured some white medicine powder into his palm. Then he used a finger from his other hand to scoop some of it into the woman's almond lips. He helplessly said to himself, although this joyful meeting pill's lustful poison cannot take a person's life, it will not be dissolved for a long period of time, greatly injuring a person's strength. I suppose doing this good deed won't take much effort. This pure spirit powder will be enough to dissolve the poison. As Han Li said this, he saw the woman unconsciously lick the medicine. With the lovely appearance of her breathing on his finger, Han Li saw her lose her vigor. Han Li didn't dare to stay here much longer. He hastily put away the medicine bottle and hurriedly sailed his magic tool far away from there. He knew that it wouldn't be long before the woman would become clear-headed. If he did not depart, he could encounter great trouble. Han Li flew in the middle of the night on the shortest route toward Yellow Maple Valley before resting for a short moment. After the sky brightened, he entered the valley with an air of confidence and returned to the 100 Medicine Garden. After he entered the garden, he immediately shut himself away. For 3 days and 3 nights, he cleared away the majority of the impurities from his dantian. After there weren't enough remaining impurities to hinder him, he slowly recovered his lost true essence. Despite this, the aftermath of the great battle still left Han Li's strength greatly depleted. He reckoned that after a couple of months of recuperation, he would return to his peak state. This caused Han Li to feel that this entire event had been very much worth it. At this time, Han Li was sitting at his desk, admiring the greatest spoils of the battle, the 2 blue foundation establishment pills the size of a broad bean. After he carefully scrutinized them for 2 hours, he returned the foundation establishment pills to a copper bottle, an auxiliary magic tool, so that their spiritual chi would not dissipate. As for the azure bottle and the wooden box, he naturally destroyed them to prevent anyone from discovering what he wished to remain concealed. With this said, it was already several days after that battle. His losses had truly been not small. Not only was his flying sword treasure talisman destroyed, that high-quality magic tool, the fine steel ring, was also sacrificed. With regards to this, Han Li felt somewhat regretful. However, his spoils were also great. Apart from the Azure Flood Dragon banner, Han Li found two other notable magic tools from senior martial brother Lu's storage pouch. The Azure Rope he used to launch a sneak attack on him, as well as a silver-white hook. They seemed to both be high-quality magic tools. This was sufficient enough to make up for his loss of magic tools. Not to mention the several tens of low to mid-grade talismans and over 20 low-grade spirit stones. It was unfortunate that there were no elementary high-grade talismans. There was only the Wind Wall Technique talisman that Han Li had turned to scrap during the battle. Han Li took advantage of this opportunity to arrange all of his loot once through. Apart from the items he would personally use and the very precious items, he destroyed the rest to avoid future troubles. After that, he started to impatiently think about the matter of the Foundation Establishment pills. Han Li was completely ignorant of how to consume the Foundation Establishment pill. Was it as simple as swallowing the Foundation Establishment by itself, or was he required to prepare other medicines in advance and perform other actions? Should he even draw support from some external power? Common conventions say that such a rare medicine pill should truly have some specific qualities. Because Han Li hadn't acquired the Foundation Establishment pill beforehand, there was nothing he previously had to pay attention to. He planned to wait until after the trial by blood and fire to ask around. After all, failure in the trial by fire would render everything else worthless. He didn't expect to possess the Foundation Establishment pill now, and moreover, have two of them at that. This was a pressing matter. Half a day later, Han Li arrived at the Cultivation Guidance Pavilion. He returned to his residence, blankly resting his upper body on the table. After being lost in thought for quite a few hours, he suddenly smashed his fist against the corner of the table, causing his fist to turn completely red. He ignored the pain as if it wasn't there. Not long before, on the pretext of wanting to learn new magic techniques, he made a few indirect inquiries toward Wu Feng for the majority of the day. Eventually, he uncovered the method of taking the Foundation Establishment pill. However, this did not result in good news for him in the slightest. It turned out that to take the Foundation Establishment pill and pass the barrier to Foundation Establishment, it did not require consuming any medicine beforehand or external aid. Unexpectedly, it merely required direct consumption. It was reasonable to say that this news couldn't be better for Han Li. However, Wu Feng's next words struck Han Li in the head. There would be a new problem that arose after taking the medicine, causing Han Li to feel greatly perplexed. Once again, Han Li found himself facing a dilemma. Chapter 172 Choice. Chapter 172 Choice. At the northern region of the Giant Province, at some desert mountain at the border of the state of Yue and the state of Yuanwu, stood several tens of yellow-clothed people of various height. Their clothes were fluttering with the wind, and their ages had nothing in common. There were some who were old and gray-haired with a face full of wrinkles, near the end of their lives, as well as smooth-skinned, white-teethed and red-lipped juveniles who had yet to enter adulthood. They all stood silently in rows. At the front was naturally an imposing old man. With his hands behind his back, he motionlessly looked toward the sky, lost in thought. There were 4 men and 1 woman behind him, each with a respectful bearing. Among them was that martial Uncle Wang who had brought Han Li to enter the sect. He currently had a solemn expression. Behind those 5 people there were 2 orderly rows of yellow-clothed disciples, all with different expressions. A few were nervous, others were either ill at ease, unconcerned, or even glancing all around. There were a few smiling silently, not showing their true intentions. At the end of the last row, there was a common dark-skinned youth with lowered eyes. He had been looking at the edge of his feet from the very beginning. He didn't dare to shift his gaze in the slightest, seeming unusually shy. However, none of these people knew that this yellow boy was silently cursing with resentment. This youth who was different from the others was Han Li. The group of yellow-clothed individuals were the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples who were about to join the trial by blood and fire. Han Li ultimately decided to participate in this almost certain-death excursion. The matter of the 2 Foundation Establishment pills was a hapless joke. A month before, After Han Li found the method to take the Foundation Establishment pill from Wu Feng, he was greatly shocked. It turned out that those taking the Foundation Establishment pill must enter seclusion for 3 months and must use up all of the medicinal power before exiting. Otherwise, the medicinal power would scatter, greatly reducing the pill's efficacy. That was why finding out whether or not one succeeded in reaching Foundation Establishment required several months. Having to wait for such a long time greatly discouraged Han Li. His original plan after acquiring the 2 Foundation Establishment pills was to first take the pills and then see whether or not he had to participate in the trial by fire. If he were lucky enough to reach Foundation Establishment, then he definitely wouldn't go to such a dangerous region. After all, only 1 in 4 survived. It was truly too frightening. If he failed after taking the pills, then it would be imperative that he would enter the forbidden area. If 2 or 3 Foundation Establishment pills wouldn't do, then he would refine 3, 4, or even more pills. He was convinced that his aptitude was far too lacking, and only by taking several Foundation Establishment pills would he be certain to enter Foundation Establishment. However, with the restriction that he must be secluded for 3 months after taking the pill, Han Li's plan was thrown into disarray, causing him to face an awkward situation where he couldn't get everything he wanted. TL, literal meaning, you can't have both the fish and the bear's paw. Now, he had to either take the Foundation Establishment pill and completely give up on entering the forbidden area, or he could temporarily put away the Foundation Establishment pill and wait until after the trial by blood and fire to consume the pills. It was impossible to have the best of both worlds. After pondering this for almost half a month, Han Li felt that, with regards to his terrible aptitude, even if he were to consume both of the Foundation Establishment pills, his chances of entering Foundation Establishment were still quite low, so he could not give up on the trial by blood and fire. Actually, it wasn't like Han Li hadn't considered waiting 5 more years to participate in the next trial by blood and fire. At that time, even if he failed to enter Foundation Establishment, his eternal spring arts would have definitely reached its peak. As such, he would have a much greater ability to defend himself. However, not long after Han Li thought of this, the Yellow Maple Valley's upper echelon made a declaration that greatly shocked the cultivation world of the state of UA, causing this idea of his to vanish into thin air. The details were, 5 years from now, the forbidden area of the trial of blood and fire would be placed under a temporarily 60-year seal. During this time, the 7 great sects would work together and forbid anyone from entering and gathering medicine. Sealing the forbidden area temporarily was not a rare affair. Almost every 300 to 400 years, the 7 great sects would do this. Because the forbidden area was often opened, the spiritual qi within would leak in great quantities. The appearance and growth of spiritual medicines would also suffer as a result. This temporarily seal was to allow the density of spiritual qi to return to normal levels. However, although the 7 great sects adopted this measure, the spiritual medicines of the forbidden area were still sparse year after year and were increasingly difficult to find. Those particular spiritual medicines required to refine pills were especially rare. According to a deduction of some knowledgeable expert from the 7 great sects, if one truly wanted to restore the spiritual medicines within the forbidden area to regular quantities, they must seal the area for no less than a full millennium. This temporarily seal was nothing more than a postponement of the eventual exhaustion of the forbidden area's spiritual medicines. After all, the growth of spiritual medicines wasn't a matter of merely 1 or 2 days. Despite the actual circumstances within the forbidden area, nobody was able to deny or confirm this conjecture. However, the leaders of the 7 great sects were incapable of such a painful decision. The quantity of Foundation Establishment pills was closely related to the rise and fall of their sects. If there was a shortage of these pills lasting 50 to 60 years, the 7 great sects would merely suffer some superficial damage. However, if several hundred or even 1,000 years passed without Foundation Establishment pills, then not just the 7 great sects, but also the entire cultivation world of the state of UA would be confronted with a life or death crisis. After all, an area without Foundation Establishment cultivators, could that still be called a cultivation world? If the time came, the cultivation clans and rogue cultivators would all depart the state of UA and look to survive elsewhere. At that time, the 7 great sects would not be an exception. As a result, although they knew that frequently opening the forbidden area was a folly equivalent to killing the chicken that laid the eggs, the 7 great sects could not help but do so. They could only hope that before the spiritual medicines of the forbidden area were truly extinguished, they could produce other spiritual medicines to replace them. This caused the great sects, core formation experts, even those nascent soul eccentrics, to go out of their way to look for another source of spiritual medicines or to find another solution to prevent their respective sects from falling. Naturally, Han Li could not have known this, but with this new information, there was no way Han Li would dare to wait 5 more years for the next trial by blood and fire. Even slow-minded individuals would realize that when the forbidden area opened in 5 years, it would unconditionally be a storm of blood. Each of the great sects, elite disciples would be put forth in order to scavenge for the last time before the forbidden area was sealed away. If Han Li did not participate in this trial by fire, then he would be bringing about his own destruction. Even if this announcement caused the upcoming trip to the forbidden area to have greater troubles and more desperate battles, regardless of this, the next was certain to be even more bloody. As for the folly of participating in the trial by blood and fire 50 years later, he didn't even think of it. By then he would have passed optimal age to enter Foundation establishment. Even if he were able to barely enter Foundation establishment, he would certainly not be able to tread the path of cultivation for much longer. This was not the outcome Han Li desired. With that way in mind, Han Li enlisted to participate in the medicine gathering group and waved his life away. Unexpectedly, the appearance of that martial Uncle Wang caused Han Li to feel greatly surprised and somewhat regretful. When Martial Uncle Wang saw Han Li, he was even more surprised. On one hand, he was greatly astonished that this new disciple would participate in the trial by blood and fire. On the other hand, he almost couldn't believe how far Han Li's cultivation had advanced. With Han Li's aptitudes, how could he progress with his cultivation from the 9th layer to the 11th layer within such a short period of time? This was far too shocking. If Han Li were an outstandingly talented disciple, then it wouldn't be strange. It would be more strange if he hadn't reached the 11th layer by now. However, he had personally tested Han Li's false spiritual roots. How could he have cultivated so fast? With regards to his spiritual roots, for Han Li to enter the sect at the 9th layer was already extraordinary. Usually, only by being bestowed magic power by an elder and frequently consuming a few spiritual medicines, along with diligent and bitter cultivation, could someone be able to achieve this. However, with Han Li currently standing before him with a cultivation base at the 11th layer, he was incomparably shocked. Since Martial Uncle Wang was doubtful, he impolitely pulled Han Li to the side and tested his attributes once more. The result was the same as before and stomped any suspicions of mutated spiritual roots. This caused Martial Uncle Wang to be at a loss. Chapter 173, The Gathering. And Li responded with, "I don't know" to all of the questions, insisting that his cultivation today was all because of his hard work. As for how he was able to cultivate and improve at this alarming rate, Han Li used a mysterious story that he had previously prepared about how he mistakenly ate a magical fruit when he was a child. He told this to Martial Uncle Wang, then blamed everything onto the magical fruit. He prepared this excuse specifically to handle this kind of situation. And Li knew that a believable lie should consist of 70% truth and 30% falsehood, so the magical fruit that he described wasn't solely from his imagination. It was a fruit that had been rumored for thousands of years, the immortal clan's dragon scale fruit. It was said that people who ate it could be reborn and could soar in the sky. As for whether or not it truly existed, there was no way for Han Li to find out, but regardless, no one had ever actually eaten it. As soon as this Martial Uncle Wang, who had read many books, heard Han Li's description of the magical fruit, his eyes brightened up. He actually found an ancient book from somewhere called The Record of Wondrous Objects, and found an article regarding the dragon scale fruit for Han Li to identify. As things had gotten to this point, Han Li would naturally admit it with ease. Amazed, Martial Uncle Wang made a tusk-tusk sound. Han Li also told him that once he picked the fruit, the plant's original roots immediately withered away and died. That way, there would absolutely be no more of this fruit even if they went back to the original location. This was to make sure the other party would not try asking around in an attempt to find more of the fruit for himself, thereby completely putting an end to the story. As for whether or not this person would be greedy, believed it to be true, or tried to go elsewhere to find another such fruit, it was none of his business. Let him busy himself with it. And Li knew very clearly that even though Martial Uncle Wang acted as if he completely believed him, and even though Han Li had answered all of his questions, there was no way of knowing how much he actually believed him. The other party was probably in half belief and half doubt. in between trusting and not trusting. So with this martial Uncle Wang, Han Li should avoid and hide from him if possible in the future, as well as pay more attention in case the other party got suspicious. But Han Li believed that as long as he could successfully enter Foundation establishment, then his identity would be quite different. Even if martial Uncle Wang still had doubts in his heart, he wouldn't provoke him that easily. After all, the cultivation world spoke with strength. Finally, Han Li brushed off the questions about his own cultivation. As for martial Uncle Wang, it was unclear whether or not he was apologetic about all the questionings from before, but he didn't make things difficult for Han Li at the registration. He helped him through all the paperwork very easily and warned him about some precautions he should prepare prior to entering the forbidden area. Han Li gave a mouthful of thanks, then said goodbye and left. After he returned, he greeted the little old man and temporarily stopped his work at the medicinal herb garden so that he could prepare for the trial by blood and fire without any distractions. Hearing this, the little old man was silent for a while. He used a strange expression that said, "You're already dead," and kept on staring at Han Li. This made Han Li's heart uneasy for a long time. But what surprised him was that before this senior martial Uncle Ma left, he gave Han Li 2 bottles of medicine without any hesitation. He said coldly, "One bottle for internal use and the other for external use." He then flew away on his flying magic tool with an indifferent expression. This gesture slightly warmed Han Li's heart. After the past 2 years of spending time together, he understood that although the little old man's temperament was eccentric, he was a person with a cold appearance and a warm heart. He was just somewhat absorbed in the art of medicine creation. He was being treated with warmth now, which meant that senior martial Uncle Ma already saw him as his nephew, making Han Li feel moved. 3 days before entering the forbidden area, martial Uncle Wang finally sent Han Li a letter, urging him to gather at the meeting hall to get ready to go. When Han Li arrived, the disciples who registered for the trial by fire and blood were all gathered there, silently judging each other. There were more than 10,000 disciples from the whole Yellow Maple Valley that were of Qi condensation. Han Li naturally wouldn't know all of them, but there was still one woman that Han Li couldn't be more familiar with. Not only did Han Li know this woman, he had seen and even touched her whole body. The junior martial sister Chen, who got drugged and almost raped by martial brother Lu. Speaking of which, after martial brother Lu had been killed by Han Li, it caused a small commotion in the Yellow Maple Valley. Even though this person hadn't even reached Foundation establishment, he was after all an owner of mutated spiritual roots, making him a low-level disciple that the sect's upper echelon paid close attention to. As for junior martial sister Chen, after she came back, for an unknown reason, she didn't discuss what had happened on that night to anyone and refused to speak of the matter. As a result, the martial brother Lu, who had disappeared for a long time, was treated as a missing person. After contacting different disciples and searching within the sect without getting any results, this matter was slowly dropped. These types of people disappeared from the valley all the time. It's not like similar situations had never occurred before. Martial brother Lu wasn't the first, and he definitely wouldn't be the last. After the initial reaction period had passed, no one in Yellow Maple Valley ever mentioned martial brother Lu again, as if he never even existed. This situation put Han Li at ease, but he also felt a cold chill. It was expected that most cultivators were people who restrained their desires. If one day Han Li himself disappeared, the reactions within the sect would presumably be not as overwhelmed by the reactions they were having now. Most likely in the blink of an eye, he would be completely forgotten, and no one would waste their time or energy trying to inquire about his whereabouts. Ever since he entered the sect, he had absolutely made the right decision by maintaining a low profile and a cautious attitude. After all, the road of cultivation was very long, so there was a high possibility for accidents to happen. If Han Li attracted more attention to himself or did stupid things to show off, then a low-level cultivator who didn't even have a background and support like him would be squashed to death by a stronger existence at any moment on the long road of cultivation. The possibility of stepping on the road of cultivation in another life would be so low it was almost non-existent. Han Li originally didn't believe in reincarnation that much, but ever since he had come in contact with the cultivation world, he had become less doubtful. The attitude of junior martial sister Chen was obviously different from before. Han Li was not sure if it was because she was affected by her lover's betrayal, but she didn't have any makeup on. She seemed cold but elegant, and her whole body was emitting an atmosphere that demanded strangers to stay away. During this time, a few young guys tried to talk to her because they were attracted by her beauty, but they were all shot down in defeat. It wasn't because the men were cheap. This woman's cold and arrogant expression not only did not reduce her beauty, but it also added a bit more mysterious charm to it. It made all the surrounding male disciples try to sneak a peek at her. This kind of charm was even more attractive than the image of a timid, lovable little woman that she had when she was with that martial brother Lu before. But after Han Li saw this, he was annoyed. There was no question that another woman who despised men was born into this world. After experiencing the betrayal of her lover, it probably won't be easy for this woman to open her heart to another man. She probably even decided to grow old and die alone. This junior martial sister Chen didn't recognize Han Li. Han Li deliberately walked in front of her a few times, but he only received a cold expression in response. She obviously saw him as one of the people who was trying to show off to her. Han Li was relieved. The psychedelic power of the joyful meeting pill really was strong. This woman didn't remember him at all. Because of this, the last thing for him to worry about was completely eliminated. But when he thought about how passionate and desirable her naked body looked that night, and then saw how cold and frozen junior martial sister Chen looked now, Han Li's heart was filled with desire and regrets. Speaking of which, the reason she would participate in the trial by blood and fire was likely thanks to him. After losing the Foundation Establishment pill, if this woman wanted to achieve Foundation Establishment, she would have to gamble for it just like him. After all, this trip to the Forbidden Area was the only fast path to getting a Foundation Establishment pill. The disciples who were participating in the trip to the Forbidden Area in the Yellow Maple Valley were truly the sect's elite, all of them strong and muscular. Just counting the disciples who reached the peak of 13th layer, there were as much as 5 or 6 of them. Most of the other disciples were at the 12th layer. Junior martial sister Chen was at the middle of the 12th layer. The rest of the disciples were in the 11th layer, and there were only 3 of them. Besides Han Li, there was an old man whose hair was all white and a young fellow who looked 16 or 17. Seeing them made Han Li feel an uneasy chill in his heart. The 3 of them were probably only there to make up for the numbers and to be cannon fodder. Following past customs, the low-level disciples who could enter the Forbidden Area in the 7 Great Sect could not exceed 25 people. The number could only be less, but not more. For the past few times, they couldn't get enough people at all. Usually they only got about 10 people to participate in the trial by blood and fire. But this time, not only did the maximum number get reached, many elite disciples appeared here. This proved that this trip to the Forbidden Area for gathering medicinal herbs would definitely exceed the normal standards of the past, and the number of people who could survive would certainly be less than a quarter. Seeing this expected scenario, Han Li, aside from cursing in his mind, was feeling completely helpless. It was no question that these elite disciples must have each been given extra incentives by the higher powers within the sect, otherwise they wouldn't have appeared here. Chapter 174, Martial Ancestor Li. Chapter 174, Martial Ancestor Li. After they heard Sect Master Zhang Lingdao's encouragements, 2 honored disciples entered the halls with trays in their hands. One of the trays had a gold-threaded storage pouch. The other tray had a small pile of multicolored mid-grade spirit stones. It seemed it was time to fulfill what was previously agreed. This could be considered the encouragement to fight. Han Li thought this slightly maliciously. The mid-grade spirit stones were basically free for everyone to choose. Han Li already had an earth attribute and a fire attribute mid-grade spirit stone, so he picked a blue water attribute spirit stone. Nobody fought him over this. However, when spiritual tools were extracted from the storage pouch, the disciples gave cautious glances. The storage pouch was unlike common storage pouches. It only required spiritual sense to store items instead of spiritual power. In addition, any spiritual power that was injected could later be absorbed by the items stored within. This bag also interrupted a cultivator's spiritual sense inspection. So long as one extended their hand, they would be able to take out any stored spiritual tool. As for what item they would take out in the end, it would be hard to say. They could only determine it with the feel of their hand. This storage pouch was specialized to extract spiritual tools and had been refined precisely for this purpose. Otherwise, its practicality couldn't be compared to that of common storage pouches, of which case who would use it. Although it was completely filled with high-quality magic tools, defensive magic tools were rarer than offensive magic tools. Furthermore, as high-quality defensive and offensive magic tools, their characteristics were greatly different. If one could take out a suitable magic tool, their odds of surviving the trial by blood and fire were sure to slightly increase. For those disciples lacking magic tools, they would be even more meticulous. However, Han Li did not care. On his previous trip to the city market, he swept clean the entire treasure collection that the 10,000 treasures store had accumulated for many years, and was able to obtain 2 magic tools of the finest quality. Not to mention the Azure Flood Dragon banner, as well as other high-quality magic tools he acquired afterwards. To receive just another high-quality magic tool did not excite him. When it was Han Li's turn to step forward, most of the people had already drawn a magic tool from the bag. As for what magic tool they drew, they naturally did not say and did not take them out for others to see. Han Li extended his hand toward the pouch and randomly made a blind grab, acquiring a peculiar-looking object. His heart grew excited, and he instantly put it into his storage pouch while taking a stealthy glance. After a moment of slight distraction, he immediately put it away. At this moment, the person behind him already impatiently moved forward. When Han Li saw this, he tactfully left and returned to the place where he originally stood. With the magic tool selection concluded, a few people came in from outside the hall. They were the many stewards Han Li saw when he first entered the sect. Martial Uncle Wang and that old man whom Han Li truly despised were included among them. These people all had an unusual expression. They all respectfully escorted a square-faced old man at their center. There wasn't even a single person who dared to whisper to one another. The old man appeared 50 to 60 years old with his hair somewhat gray. However, he had a healthy red face and a spirited complexion with a pair of naturally imposing tiger eyes. With a single look, one could tell that this person was of a resolute disposition. After his gaze swept past the disciples, Han Li immediately felt that his 5 viscera and 6 bowels had been clearly seen by this person, causing him to be overwhelmed with amazement. The moment Great Sect Master Zhang saw this man walk in, he hastily welcomed him as Martial Uncle Li with a faint trace of flattery. Seeing this, the disciples were greatly stunned. However, the other stewards' expressions were as usual. Not only did they lack any contempt, but they also showed great envy when they saw this elder respond to Zhang Lingdao with a few words. It seemed that to have this elder respond to the words, "Martial Uncle," was a seldom held honor. As Han Li and the other unknowing young disciples were astonished at the sight before them, Sect Master Zhang introduced this elder to the crowd of disciples. The name of this Martial Uncle Li was a name Han Li and company had long heard of. He was one of the core formation martial ancestors that they had never seen, Martial Ancestor Li. This trip to the Forbidden Area would be led by Martial Ancestor Li along with a squad of stewards, including Martial Uncle Wang. After Sect Master Zhang's introduction, Martial Ancestor Li very clearly and concisely said the 2 words, "set off," concluding Han Li's and the other juniors' first encounter with him. Then he took the lead, departing from the hall. Han Li and company were completely dumbfounded. However, they hurriedly followed closely at the steward's urging. As the disciples left the hall, they inhaled a breath of cold air. Just as they left the hall, they saw a huge, brilliant silver monster over 20 zhang long, suspended in midair. Its enormous body produced an oppressive grandeur, bringing about a feeling of suffocation. That Martial Ancestor Li was standing on top of the head of the monster and watching them with indifference. Han Li rubbed his eyes and then carefully looked several times as his heart continued to jump. What he clearly saw was unexpectedly a seldom-seen silver python. However, this python was truly extraordinary. Its head had an additional jet-black horn, causing it to appear ever more terrifying and malevolent. This is the strength of a core formation expert. He's even able to cause this demonic beast to yield and follow his orders as he pleases. This is far too incredible. Han Li was completely convinced by this martial ancestor's method. If he were to reach core formation, then he would also hold such great magic power. Han Li felt all the blood in his body flow backwards from excitement. Before he saw Martial Ancestor Li, Han Li felt that his vague and muddled path of cultivation was not clear. But after this moment of shock, the might of this martial ancestor's profoundly amazing magic gave him a clear figure to pursue on the path of cultivation, greatly securing his confidence to cultivate the path of immortality. "Everyone, come up and stand well behaved. My horned silver python's flight speed is far faster than your magic tools. It will only require 2 days to reach the destination." It was as if Martial Ancestor Li did not see the chaotic circumstances below him. After he lightly stroked the silver python's huge horn, he gave this instruction with a tranquil expression. Like that, Han Li and company stood on the python with fear and trepidation and rushed through their journey for 2 days and 2 nights. Eventually, they arrived at some nameless desert mountain. This martial ancestor truly did not speak falsely. The speed of this monster's flight was truly astonishing, far greater than what the disciples' flying tools were capable of. It was only natural, as none of them had a good flying tool. When they arrived, the crowd of disciples received a few bits of information from the stewards. This was where the sects agreed to assemble. The 7 great sects would assemble there and set off together to the forbidden area, since the power of a sole sect or clan was not enough to enter the forbidden area. The appointed time was tomorrow morning. However, because the forbidden area was within the borders of the Jing province, Yellow Maple Valley was considered to be half a host. As a result, the sect arrived a day earlier and would wait for the other sects at this mountain. Right now, the crowd of disciples could freely move. Tomorrow, they would have to meet together and move in an orderly fashion. Since the stewards have said as such, Han Li and the others naturally dispersed. They went about the mountain doing their own things, making a few final preparations on the eve of a great battle. Thus, among the 20-plus yellow-clothed disciples, there were those who sat cross-legged and honed their spirit, and others who took out their magic tools and continuously wiped them clean. There were also those who were blankly lost in thought with an appearance of deep worry. But there were even several people who chatted as usual, filled with ease. They were completely relaxed, as if they were on a sightseeing trip. Han Li paid particular attention to these few people. At this moment, Han Li heard the sounds of footsteps behind him, and he slightly wrinkled his brow. In order to remain inconspicuous, he deliberately chose to sit alone at an unremarkable corner. Why would someone come here? Junior Marshal Brother Han, my humble self named Xiang salutes you. I wish to speak to Junior Marshal Disciple about tomorrow's early trip to the forbidden area. This concerns Junior Marshal Brother's life or death. Could we have a chat? The aged but smooth voice caused Han Li's brows to become even more tense. Although Han Li had not yet seen the voice's owner, Han Li could already tell that this man was crafty and could be considered untrustworthy. He immediately assumed that trouble had come to find him. However, Han Li understood that it would be better to offend a gentleman than to offend a villain. Although he was completely unwilling, he reluctantly turned around and saw 2 people behind him, one old and one short. Chapter 175, Clear Void Sect. Chapter 175, Clear Void Sect. After he clearly saw the 2 people's appearances, Han Li inwardly sighed. They were unexpectedly the same as him, disciples who have cultivated to the 11th layer. One appeared old, but his eyes showed a trace of cunning. The other appeared honest and naive. It was clear that he was an inexperienced youngster. This strange pair had sought him, causing Han Li to truly feel a bit surprised. However, Han Li faintly guessed their purpose in coming after some slight thought. Is there something on these senior martial brothers' minds? Han Li coldly asked from courtesy, but he used an unintimate tone, undoubtedly revealing his attempt to have them retreat from an awkward situation. Clearly, this senior martial brother Xiang's face was far thicker than Han Li imagined. Not only did he not mind Han Li's 1,000 miles distant tone, but actually used a familiar and enthusiastic tone. Does Junior Marshal Brother Han have a good plan for tomorrow's trip to the forbidden area? Our magic power is quite meager. It's quite possible that we will be the first to fall in a fiery melee with the other sects. Wouldn't it be better for us to negotiate and think of a countermeasure? When Han Li heard this, he blinked his eyes several times and didn't speak. Nevertheless, he was completely certain of the other party's intentions. Their words were pretty close to his own guesses. It seemed this old schemer planned to rope in a few disciples with feeble magic power and have them move and fight together, increasing security by much as well as greatly increasing their odds of survival. However, Han Li clearly understood that this action came with both advantages and disadvantages. If people were to concentrate in one place, the area they could search would be considerably less, greatly decreasing the amount of spiritual medicines they could find. As for how the spiritual medicines would be distributed in the end, that was also hard to say. It would probably be decided by strength. Han Li naturally hadn't the slightest interest in an alliance. Not only would there be no advantages, but he was also more than likely to be used as cannon fodder. As for this old schemer, he probably held no good intentions and was certain to take advantage of a crisis for personal gain by resorting to self-serving manipulations. The old man saw that Han Li remained speechless after he finished speaking. He couldn't help but feel anxious, so he flusteredly said, "I actually have an idea. Perhaps junior martial disciple has heard these words before, but this idea will absolutely ensure that everyone survives safely through the trip." The old man put up a profoundly mysterious expression and squeezed the wrinkles on his forehead for a moment. Han Li found his appearance to be quite humorous. The yellow-haired youngster next to him seemed to greatly admire this old schemer. Although he didn't say anything, he exposed an expectant expression towards the old man. Since he absolutely wasn't going to join their alliance, Han Li was unwilling to be tangled any further and bluntly rejected. "I am sorry. My humble self is not accustomed to working with others. I also do not intend to do so this time as well. If senior martial brother wishes to join hands with others, then it would best to look for other junior martial brothers." Han Li spoke very straightforwardly and incisively. Han Li knew that only by clearly showing that he wasn't an inexperienced novice would he able to make the other party give up and not continue to tangle with him. Otherwise, if this senior martial brother Xiang felt there was the slightest chance to convince his fellow sect member, he would mostly likely continue to pester him. Han Li did not want to be bothered by this person. When old man Xiang heard this, he realized he sought the wrong target. Although the person before him seemed quite young, his words were practiced and careful. He was clearly an experienced person who had passed through trials and hardships. The old man spoke no more rubbish and took his leave with a slightly angry appearance. Han Li saw them head in the direction of another disciple, who was currently meditating on top of a rock. Han Li faintly smiled and turned his body back, continuing to observe the several noteworthy fellow sect members. However, this time he saw junior martial sister Chen and a woman of a common appearance standing next to her. There were a few talented and handsome men faintly gathering nearby. The corner of Han Li's mouth moved several times. Although he did not know why, he felt unfavorably towards those few men. He finally decided that what was out of sight was out of mind, and looked for an uninhabited area to close his eyes and rest. Like that, the next morning had arrived. All of the disciples arrived at the mountain peak once more and stood in orderly rows, waiting for the arrival of the other immortal sects. After waiting for several hours, they had yet to see a single person, causing Han Li to inwardly rain endless curses. He almost suspected that the other sects were doing this deliberately as to consume the physical strength of everyone from Yellow Maple Valley. However, what caused Han Li to feel even more distraught was that, as chance had it, junior martial sister Chen had been assigned to stand to his right. With the familiar scent of her body occasionally entering his nostrils, his imagination was somewhat let loose as if he was returning to that extremely alluring night. In order to cover up the oddities from his face, with no better option left, Han Li lowered his head and feigned the appearance of great unease. However, his heart was filled with great and unending complaints. She was a pretty woman, but could her beauty go as far as for him to lose his self-control? However, this martial ancestor Li whom Han Li greatly admired stood at the very front. He stood with his face to the sky and was able to stand in such a manner for an unexpectedly long amount of time. It was unknown whether or not he went on a mental journey or if he was pondering about something. Suddenly, Han Li felt a disturbance in his surroundings. It seemed that something happened. He could not help but raise his head. His fellow sect members all looked up toward the sky without exception and looked toward the horizon. Han Li also followed their gazes. He saw that there were several star-like twinkling streaks of light in the deep blue sky, gradually growing larger. A short moment later, a series of black dots also appeared. Underneath the black dots, the silver lights flashed. It seemed the black dots were riding the streaks of starlight across the sky. Seeing this marvel, everyone became even more restless. "Quiet, what kind of children are you? This is the Clear Void Sect's flying magic tool, the Rainbow Snowsoak. Do not make a fuss and lose face for our Yellow Maple Valley." A short and stout middle-aged steward turned his head to give several reprimanding words with a dark complexion. Those words were quite effective. The restlessness was immediately settled, and after that there were only occasional whispers. At this moment, the black dots already became clear. Each of them was a cultivator wearing gray Taoist robes. The majority of them were true Taoist priests, each holding a horsetail whisk with their hair tied up into a bun. However, those who did not wear Taoist robes appeared to be mortals, as if they were sheltered children who had yet to leave home. Han Li and the others clearly saw that the stars beneath their feet were actually a stiff white rainbow bridge covered with dazzling specks of silver-white light. It was unknown how the specks of light were embedded within the object. As Han Li carefully watched the scene, the white rainbow bridge carrying the Clear Void Sect's members descended onto the mountain and landed across from the members of Yellow Maple Valley. Their leader, a middle-aged Taoist priest, lightly moved his hand, and the white light flashed. The rainbow snowsilk's rainbow bridges disappeared, and in his hand appeared a brocade object. I didn't think that Benefactor Li would be leading this time. This humble Taoist Fu Yunzi greets you. This Taoist priest walked several steps to the front of martial ancestor Li and spoke with radiant happiness. From his tone, it seemed they were acquaintances. Humph, if this old facetious Taoist could come, then why couldn't I come? Martial ancestor Li bluntly said with both hands behind his back. Within each sect, we've entered core formation the latest. If we didn't do these errands, who would? The Taoist priest didn't mind in the least, and he swung his horsetail whisk with a constant smile. This old facetious Taoist is wily and cunning. Last time, you brought suffering upon me. Don't think you will get the chance to do so again. What is Benefactor Li talking about? Recognizing lost bets is a right and proper matter. Who was possibly wronged? The Taoist priest laughed. When martial ancestor Li heard this, a cold light flashed through his eyes. It seemed that he was about to be angry, but he immediately thought of something and stepped down with grandeur, unwillingly saying, "After that chunk of iron essence was refined into your great azure sword, its power greatly increased. This Li spent 10 years purifying it, but nonetheless had to cheaply give it away to this old facetious Taoist." His words contained great grievances. It was clear he felt much heartache over that iron essence. So it turns out that the renowned immortal Master Li actually cared so much about a mere piece of iron essence. Fine, this time I will produce another item, one definitely greater than that iron essence. If you win this bet, you will be able to make up for your previous loss. The Taoist priest said with a smile as he twirled his beard. Chapter 176, Making a Bet. Chapter 176, Making a Bet. No bet? Absolutely not. Do you think that I would do the same thing twice? Martial ancestor Li shook his head as if he were beating a drum and voiced his refusal. No bet? Benefactor Li's standards are actually so high. Does the blood from the inner core of a demonic flood dragon not even enter his eyes? The Taoist priest wore an astonished expression as if he couldn't believe it. However, when Han Li saw his expression, he felt it was very false. Blood from a flood dragon's inner core. Although martial ancestor Li originally intended to absolutely refuse to be pulled into a relationship with the Taoist priest, when he heard the name of the item, his expression abruptly changed, and his words somewhat trembled. Yes, if Benefactor Li wants to know about this item, I shall explain. 30 years ago, at the dangerous rapids of the state of Yuan Wu's coiling Dragon River, I paid a great price for this item so I could procure it for Benefactor. The Taoist priest calmly and leisurely said while eating up the other party's expression. Impossible. How could the blood of a flood dragon be acquired, not to mention blood kept in its inner core? This is not something that can be said without thinking. Are you making fun of me? Martial ancestor Li sobered up from his excitement and exposed an appearance of doubt. Is this humble Taoist not a monk? I would not lie. Benefactor can take a look for himself. The Taoist priest did not want to waste time explaining and merely flipped his hand, revealing a white sphere filled with wisps of blood. Martial ancestor Li's eyes widened, wishing he could rush over and grab it. If Benefactor's horned silver python were to consume this core and undergo secluded cultivation for 10 to 20 years, in all likelihood it would leap from the middle stage of foundation establishment to the late stage. With another 100 years of bitter cultivation, it wouldn't be impossible to enter core formation. The Taoist priest's words were filled with enticement. When martial ancestor Li heard these words, he coldly snorted and stiffened his face. It seemed he was unmoved, but his indefinite and flickering gaze exposed the restlessness of his heart. With such a rare wager, why is Benefactor hesitating for so long? Could it be you truly don't think very highly of the strength of your valley's disciples? The Taoist priest curled his lips, goading him to accept. To say the disciples of our Yellow Maple Valley are inferior to those of your Clear Void sect is overcritical. Martial ancestor Li wore a displeased expression. He swept his eyes past the party behind the Taoist priest and immediately gained a rough estimate of the Clear Void sect's disciples. Their strength was about the same as that of the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples. Fine, I will gamble. However, what treasure of mine would you have me wager? After a moment of consideration from martial ancestor Li, he felt that his odds of winning were 50%. With the addition of his extreme longing for that inner core, he eventually nodded and agreed. However, he still cautiously asked that question. This humble Taoist isn't interested in any of Benefactor's other treasures. If he happens to luckily win, then he desires Benefactor to give this humble Taoist 2 equivalent chunks of iron essence 20 years from now. The essence of Benefactor Li's true fire is clear. It is quite famous among the 7 great sects. For you, this is surely a trivial matter, the Taoist priest said with squinted eyes and a smile. Even so, a faint trace of treachery was contained within his words. You want 2 equivalent chunks of iron essence. Martial ancestor Li's complexion was unsightly, and he almost jumped immediately after hearing these words. You old facetious Taoist, you plan to have me toil bitterly. How is that? So long as you win, you aren't required to. This is the inner core of a grade 2 demonic beast, equivalent to that of us initial core formation stage experts. It is absolutely worth the price, the Taoist priest said while shaking his head. Martial ancestor Li's complexion grew uncertain. After a moment, he eventually extended his palm and coldly asked, Are we following the same rules as last time? Which sect gathers the most spiritual medicines, followed by the quality, and lastly the number of people who leave the forbidden area alive? Of course, it will be the same as before. The Taoist priest was greatly happy and hastily extended his palm. He struck it against the other party's, officializing the bet. A sharp paw sounded out. Although the Taoist priest struck his palm, he wasn't happy in the least and was actually grieving. The palm he struck was not martial ancestor Li's, but rather a different, filthy hand. This hand strangely appeared between the two and was covered with grease and filth. Nobody knew when it had last been washed. 2 sects, disciples who had been closely paying attention to the 2 martial ancestors' dialogue were stunned by this ghostly scene. Senior Qiang, the Taoist priest and martial ancestor, Li yelled at the same time with a green complexion. Who is a senior? I don't dare to be regarded as such. I am at core formation, much like yourselves. It's just that I happened to enter it a few years earlier. The lazy voice that came from between them was spoken by a queerly dressed man. This person wore a blue garment with several patches and had short hair that was several inches long. He had an azure cloth bag at his waist that had been washed pale. Even though his bag made it seem like he was a person who loved cleanliness, his face was smothered with dark grease to the point where his true face could not be seen. A few years, more like several hundred. After clearly seeing the person's appearance, martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest bitterly smiled. They both let out a regretful sigh. It was this person as expected. However, they didn't dare to show the slightest disrespect. Not only was this eccentric a step into the nascent soul stage, but his age alone was large enough to scare people. Furthermore, his self-created incorporeal evasion technique had shaken the cultivation world and was well known in the cultivation sects of nearby countries. It was unknown whether it was because his death was imminent or if he was unable to enter nascent soul, but in the past 100 years, he had become more and more eccentric and became very fond of teasing other core formation experts. Nearly all of the tens of these high-level experts had been pranked to exhaustion. However, there was nothing even his sect's great martial ancestors could do to him. With regards to the deepness of his magic power, this person was number 1 among core formation experts. As for background, he was a member of the strongest sect among the 7 great sects, the Masked Moon sect. If one were to look for one of the sect's nascent soul authorities to lecture him, these authorities were likely to ignore those people as they were unwilling to invite trouble over such trivial matters. As it was, this person was among the higher powers in the cultivation world, known for being an evil tyrant and a hoodlum. Essentially, whoever saw him was subject to the whims of fate. They could only hope that his mood for the day was good, else suffering from his small tricks would be unavoidable. When this senior suddenly graced them with his presence, how could martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest not be startled and feel their stomachs grow restless? These 2 people have already suffered from his torment. Since you've made a wager just so that you're not too lonely, count this rotten old man in as well. This great senior's mood seemed to be quite good. However, his words caused the 2 to complain incessantly. Senior must be joking. How could the disciples of our sects compare to the Masked Moon sect's brilliant students? We would be certain to lose, so there is no need to gamble. We respectfully concede, said the Taoist priest with a forced smile. Martial ancestor Li closed his lips, but his face revealed an expression that showed he was 120% in favor of those words. When the exalted old man heard this, he coldly laughed several times and turned his eyes, strangely saying, "How could I take such an unfair advantage? Be at ease, so long as the performance of both your sects surpass my own, then that will count as my loss. Afterwards, you can then decide who won among yourselves." Really? When the Taoist priest heard this, he could not help but let out a breath of relief. Although this person was moody and laughed or scolded as he desired, his words were certainly resolute and decisive, and he never turned his back on a promise. With that said, this wager could be regarded as fair, even giving the two a small advantage. I refined these 3 incorporeal needle treasure talismans at a whim, but I don't have any juniors, so I will stake them in the gamble. This elder raised his hand, suddenly revealing 3 talismans with a 7-colored needle drawn on each one. He then put them away in an instant. When martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest saw this, they were unable to conceal the alarm on their faces. They couldn't help but look at each other and make out the greed in each other's eyes. Chapter 177. Righteous and Evil of the Cultivation World. This treasure was refined from the essence of the 5 metals and was meant to be integrated with this man's creation, the incorporeal evasion technique. It could arrive without a shadow and leave without a trace. As it could injure without form, it was truly difficult to deal with. It was said that it would even give nascent soul experts a grand headache. It was one of the treasures this senior relied on to oppress others. Even if they obtained the formless needle treasure talisman, on the mere basis of its miraculous invisibility, it could be considered a wondrous life-saving treasure. At the very least, core formation experts would be unable to cope with this strange object. Good, this one will wager in accordance to this exalted senior's words. After slight consideration, the Taoist priest agreed after feeling that the terms were acceptable. As for martial ancestor Li, with the thought of reaping huge benefits, he clenched his teeth and tacitly agreed. Papa. The 3 mutually struck their palms with each other, making their wager official. Senior, why have you come here? Could it be that the masked moon sex group consists of only you? Once the 3 separated, the Taoist priest suddenly thought of something and asked this question. I've brought a group, so the sect can feel at ease. The one leading the sect is that girl Nai Chang. I've merely come along to see whether or not there were any new ferocious young people in any of the other sects, the esteemed senior unhappily remarked after widely opening his eyes. Now that I've taken a look, they're pretty much the same. I reckon that the truly talented disciples in Martial Nephew's sect would hardly be put forward. They would certainly be treated like treasures. Think about it. Without experiencing dangerous encounters, what's the use if they are talented? The moment they meet nefarious entities, they will be slaughtered like sheep. This senior seemed to greatly disapprove of the sect's way of handling things, and wore a "you are all gravely mistaken" expression. When martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest heard this, their faces didn't change in the slightest, but they were cursing silently in their hearts. This old eccentric actually says this easily. How would our sects casually bring our more talented disciples to participate in this trial by fire where they're almost certain to die? Do you think of us as idiots? They could go elsewhere to get experience. Why insist in coming to this bloody restricted area? Naturally, these words could only be smothered in their bellies. They absolutely wouldn't dare to speak this in front of this man. Otherwise, wouldn't that just be bringing misfortune upon themselves? The Taoist priest and martial ancestor were rather tactful. Naturally, this further proved that in the cultivation world, those with large fists have simple reasoning. The disciples of the 2 sects clearly heard about the matter of the trio's wager on the trip to the forbidden area and could not help but burst into an uproar. Their expressions had nothing in common and appeared extremely odd. Naturally, no one would be so stupid to directly denounce the 3, so they could only keep their resentment to themselves. Otherwise, with the mere movement of their pinky, the lives of these novice cultivator were forfeit. When martial ancestor Li saw those 2 depart, he turned around to sweep his face across the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples. Then he coldly said a few words that caused Han Li and the others to be stunned. I am aware that you feel our wager on your lives seems to hold you in far too little regard. Were it someone else, perhaps they would provide an excuse, but I have always disdained this. I will clearly tell you that this is the true appearance and cruel nature of the cultivation world. This can be considered a few words of advice. Hear this well. In the world of cultivation, regardless of whether you're a righteous person from a prestigious clan or an evil fiend who abandoned the Tao, advancement is an act against nature where only the strong survive. However, those who are righteous progress slowly, and their success will flow naturally where conditions are correct. their cultivation arts are relatively gentle. But they often act villainously under the false pretense of exterminating evil and defending the Tao, mostly hypocrites that feign righteousness. Those demonic sects that follow the Tao of devils make every effort to greatly advance their magic power, blindly pursuing formidable, mighty cultivation arts and fiercely cultivating malicious amount of yin energy. They are also disliked for being opportunistic. Although they claim to be following their heart's desires and displaying their true nature, in reality, their actions gradually become more extreme as they progress in cultivation. They lose their human nature until they become bloodthirsty and cruel. However, regardless of whether the sect lies on the righteous or evil side, it is only a matter of how they are portrayed. In reality, both follow the rule that the weak are prey to the strong. Us cultivators are the same as the mortals of the secular world. Experts on the higher realm of cultivation look upon low-level cultivators as powerless insects. They are unworthy of being spoken to and will die in a single strike. This is a normal matter. With this said, martial ancestor Li paused. His voice seemed to hold some disapproval toward these so-called righteous and evil sects. This attitude caused the disciples to feel somewhat confused. A somewhat bold disciple could not help but ask, "Martial ancestor, is our Yellow Maple Valley righteous or villainous?" We are neither righteous nor villainous. The other 6 sects are also the same," he replied with a cold smile. "You are all young, and the time since you've entered the sect is short. That is why you haven't yet been informed of the history of the state of UA's cultivation world. 1,000 years ago, our state of UA was like the other regions, in opposition between righteousness and evil. During that time, the 7 great sects were small sects that had yet to enter the fray. In order to survive, they were forced to become righteous or evil according to the way the wind blew. If a side's strength was slightly greater, those small sects would join that side. These great righteous and evil sects fundamentally looked down upon them with contempt. However, later the righteous and evil sides broke out into an extremely desperate battle that exhausted all of their experts. After that battle, their strength was greatly depleted, so they no longer had the strength to suppress Yellow Maple Valley along with the other small sects. After a period of time, our 7 great sects managed to join hands and surpass the 2 sides, thoroughly extinguishing their ideology and avoiding future problems. The current cultivation arts you've learned are actually the spoils of war from back then. This was the period when our 7 great sects established ourselves as the lone great powers in the state of UA. If there are still righteous or evil sects that wish to invade this place, our 7 sects will immediately join hands and repel them. We will absolutely prevent them from establishing themselves. As a result, the cultivation arts our 7 great sects teach include those from both righteous and evil sects along with a few unique ones as well. In the dispute, we could be regarded as neutral. When martial ancestor Li said this, he couldn't help but wear a content expression. Previously, you all continuously and bitterly cultivated in the valley. Whenever you left the sect mountains, you've all traveled around the large area of the state of UA but have never met with the true world of cultivation, nor have yet experienced the dark and bloody side of the cultivation world. However, during earlier periods, on the sides of righteousness and evil existed the 5 great cultivation schools side by side: Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, devilish, and demonic. The degree of chaos during that time exceeds your very imagination, making it seem as if pillaging and genocide were simply common occurrences. With this said, his expression grew completely solemn, but soon after his face relaxed. Then he coldly added, "All right, I'm going to wake you all up a bit to prevent you all from becoming arrogant. Remember that in the world of cultivation, if your strength does not equal another's, don't blindly speak respectful words. This so-called respect can only be given to those experts far above the rest. Otherwise, you'll be bringing about your own destruction." I wonder how many of you will live to truly comprehend these words after a few days. When Han Li and the other disciples had heard this, they were already at a loss for words and were exceptionally shocked. The words spoken to these disciples were far too surprising. You should have heard the wager we made previously. This particular wager, however, is quite significant to me. So long as I win the wager, I definitely won't treat you all unfairly. Those disciples who help me win will be heavily rewarded. As for the one who contributes the most, I will personally take him as a disciple after he reaches foundation establishment. The Yellow Maple Valley's disciples who still hadn't comprehended the sincere advice were suddenly excited by the grand promise following it. To be able to become an apprentice to a core formation expert, those who received this privilege were but a few tens. This was a golden opportunity that only occurred every 1,000 years. Seeing the crowd before him excited with eagerness in each of their eyes, martial ancestor Li faintly smiled and was greatly satisfied. So long as he won this wager, to remember 3 or 4 disciples' names was a trivial matter. At most, he would simply settle down in some area and pass down some superficial cultivation arts. Wasn't that matter easily resolved? Chapter 178, Masked Moon Sect. Han Li was moved after hearing the reward. He knew clearly that on the path of cultivation, he could definitely go through less trouble if a master could guide and point him in the right direction. This would benefit his cultivation. But at the same time, this martial ancestor Li was definitely not someone he could lie to easily. Han Li had plenty of secrets himself, and if he was in contact with him for too long, Han Li was afraid that he would sense that something was wrong. If martial ancestor Li questioned him, it would be Han Li seeking his own death. Moreover, hearing those pieces of advice he gave earlier, this person must not be someone who cherished the relationship between a master and a disciple. He would most likely use the discipleship to have others prey on the weak and kill for the treasure. After thinking about it carefully, Han Li's somewhat enticed mind calmed down right away. The other Yellow Maple Valley disciples didn't have these kinds of misgivings. They were each rubbing their palms as their morale rose greatly. Now they not only had to battle for their survival, but they also had to fight for their own future. Han Li unconsciously took a look at junior martial sister Chen and saw her blushed cheeks, her fists that were held tightly, and her shining eyes. It looked like she had made her decision. Han Li sighed to himself and didn't bother to keep paying attention to other people from the Yellow Maple Valley. Instead, he looked towards the Clear Void sect. That Taoist priest was shooting off his mouth to the people of the sect. He acted very excited from time to time and made those young Taoist priests cheer each time. Each one of them was excited. It seemed like the brainwashing was successful. Of course, there were also some elder Taoist priests whose expressions remained calm all along, not affected whatsoever. Just as Han Li thought it was interesting and was enjoying it, someone suddenly yelled, "Look, the people from the Masked Moon Sect are here. It's the heavenly divine moon boat." Hearing this, Han Li was stunned and looked up into the sky. A small bright white dot was shining in the sky, slowly approaching. Its speed was extremely fast. No long after, it was in the sky above the mountain. It was actually an enormous ship sculpted from green jade. Outside the wall of the ship was a delicate drawing of a dragon and a phoenix, making the ship seem extremely luxurious. There was even an incredibly large white shield surrounding the ship. The ship was filled with a large crowd, half of them men and the other half women, all of whom were clad in white. The one leader was an attractive young woman who was well dressed. Each of her movements was amorous and stirred people's souls. After this woman got off from the Jade ship and removed the white shield, she opened her almond-shaped lips lightly and said, "To martial brothers, martial Uncle Qiang, here is Nai Chang's greetings." Martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest couldn't dare to keep her waiting and immediately returned the courtesy. On the other hand, that senior Qiang grinned on contrary, when suddenly his figure became blurry. He disappeared into the air, leaving a sentence and some prideful yet strange laughter. 7 days from now I will come back here, prepare the wager beforehand. This time I will surely win. The Taoist priest and martial ancestor Li looked at each other. They didn't know why this old man had such confidence. They checked earlier, and even though the Masked Moon Sect's disciples were indeed stronger than their 2 sects, there was no reason to boast. The young woman's beautiful eyes looked around, and she asked out of curiosity. After finding out the details of the bet, she couldn't help but laugh. Her laughter could shake a flower's branches and suck in people's hearts and souls. That young woman's flirtatious manner made many of the young male disciples from the 3 sects stare blatantly and almost drool. But the Taoist priest and martial ancestor Li couldn't care about the wonderful scene in front of them since both of their hearts just dropped. They felt like they had walked into a trap, and their faces couldn't help but become bitter. Was it possible that the Masked Moon Sect had some kind of trump card prepared for this trip that could suppress both of the sects? The 2 of them controlled themselves. Even though they felt gloomy about this, they felt embarrassed to directly ask the young woman for the whole story. As for the beautiful young woman, Celestial Nai Chang, she naturally pretended not to know about it and took pleasure in doing so. She led the conversation away and started chatting about some other interesting things. The sight of Han Li and the other male disciples from Yellow Maple Valley had already focused onto the large crowd of female disciples that just arrived. They had previously heard that the Masked Moon Sect promoted pair cultivation techniques, So at least half of the recruited disciples were females, and they absolutely did not accept below-average appearances. Now seeing it for themselves, the female disciples' reputation was really well-deserved. This group of women were each ravishingly beautiful, as fair as a flower and gorgeous like the moon. Watching them made them keep drooling, their minds running wild. Han Li was slightly better off. Although for a moment he feasted his eyes, with his outstanding willpower, he was quickly able to restrain his mind and calm his heart. That was when he realized that the female disciples from the masked moon sect seemed to be used to being watched by so many people at the same time. Their expression didn't change as they chatted among themselves freely. Some of them even winked a few times towards the people who were watching them, making those spectators lose strength in their legs and have butterflies in their stomachs without knowing what to make of it. But the male disciples' reactions were exactly the opposite. Each of their eyes showed anger. They especially cared of the young girls beside them, so they furiously returned the gaze of everyone who was staring. And Li smiled softly. He understood just by looking at the men and women standing together in pairs that even if these pairs were not really couples, they must be pairs that had been arranged for cultivation. That was why the male disciples were so furious. They probably already saw the person beside them as their private property, even if the female disciples didn't think the same way. Strangely, Han Li noticed that the male disciples were staring not only at the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples, but also toward the people from the Clear Void sect. Under his curiosity, he turned his head and saw that the small and vigorous Taoist priests were indeed peeking at the young girls from time to time, and then immediately turned their sight away, as if they were afraid of being caught in their act. They seemed extremely sneaky. And Li tried to press down the hilarious feeling in his heart, afraid that he would actually laugh out loud. Although he wasn't sure whether he got the right impression, Han Li kept having the feeling that the female disciples from the masked moon sect were giving more flirtatious winks to the small Taoist priests than to the Yellow Maple Valley side. This left him speechless for a while. But when he thought better of it, Han Li felt dreadful in his heart. These disciples did not come here to flirt, but rather for a battle of survival. If each of the sect's young disciples went up against the masked moon sect's female disciples, Han Li was afraid that they would lose a third of the battle even before the fight started. After all, not everyone would be able to directly take down these beautiful women. What puzzled Han Li even more was that the disciples from the masked moon sect, regardless of whether they were either a man or a woman, they were all very young. Not one of them was old, which didn't make sense. If someone were to say that some of these people were actually old monsters that possessed eternal youth, Han Li would absolutely not believe it. Watching their flirtatious actions, they were at most about 20 years old, and there were no signs of aging on their figures. But since this trial by blood and fire was known as a suicidal trip, it was impossible for so many young people to come here to die on their own volition. Even if that were the case, it was impossible for them to come in so many pairs. Han Li would die before he believed that their relationships were all so deep that they could live and die together. Both the Yellow Maple Valley and the Clear Void sect had some elderly figures in their lineup. Because their time was almost up, even if they didn't participate in this trip to the Forbidden Area, they wouldn't live long. Therefore, they vainly attempted to make a last-ditch effort. If they could successfully obtain the Foundation Establishment pill and then luckily enter Foundation Establishment, their fate would be completely different. Even though there would definitely be no hope of cultivating to core formation, it would still be a gain to be able to live for another 100 years. Even though there weren't that many old folks with these thoughts who came to participate in the trial by blood and fire, there was still a total of 7 or 8 from the two sects, and yet the masked moon sect didn't have any. This was a bit strange in Han Li's eyes. Martial ancestor Li and the Taoist priest seemed to have realized that something was wrong, and their faces darkened even more. Even though they were still chatting with Celestial Nai Chang from the masked moon sect, anyone could tell that they have drifted off in their minds. Shortly after, the rest of the 4 sects all arrived one by one. The ones who left the biggest impression on Han Li were the ones from the Giant Sword sect and the Spirit Beast Mountain. Everyone from the Giant Sword sect was male. They were all dressed in black, each with a giant, sheathless sword on their backs. With extremely cold expressions on their faces, they each gave off a murderous spirit. The people from the Spirit Beast Mountain were dressed in very colorful and flashy clothing, wearing all kinds of leather with numerous pockets. There even seemed to be living creatures moving around in their clothes. This frightened the disciples from the other sects to no end. As for the people from the Saber Transformation Dock and the Heavenly Imperial Fortress, aside from how they each dressed, They were at least considered normal people in Han Li's eyes. They were like the Yellow Maple Valley's disciples, and many of them were whispering with nervous faces. Chapter 179, Breaking the Barrier. While the leaders of every sect gathered together to discuss how to open the forbidden area, Han Li was not idle. He was sizing up the vicious characters of each of the sects. Toward a few experts at the peak of the 13th layer of their cultivation art, Han Li was calculating whether he could hide, escape, or hide behind someone. Han Li absolutely didn't wish for another battle like the one he had with senior martial brother Lu, and exhaust every last drop of magic power. It should be known that this situation was completely different from that last time. This time, he didn't face a single enemy, but rather great numbers of red-eyed cultivators. If he did not preserve his strength and continuously maintain his power to strike back, he would certainly be one of the first to be eliminated. While he was looking from the side and pondering, Han Li suddenly felt as if someone was staring at him. He was slightly alarmed and could not help but return the gaze. A female disciple from the Spirit Beast Mountain was somewhat evasively looking at Han Li. After seeing her beautiful face, he unexpectedly felt somewhat familiar with her. Han Li was shocked. He recognized that woman. A slim figure appeared from the depths of his memory. It's her, the girl who sold me the golden sincerity brush at the Great South Valley. How did she enter Spirit Beast Mountain set and participate in this trial by blood and fire? The young woman was even more charming than he had remembered, causing him to be somewhat doubtful. However, her easily blushing face remained fresh in his memory, and he felt very favorable towards her. With this thought, he could not help but smile toward the young woman. It was obvious the young woman had clearly seen his smile, since her two cheeks were suddenly flushed red. It seemed she was as easily embarrassed as before. The fully bearded man who stood behind the young woman seemed to notice the actions of Han Li and the young woman, and his complexion sunk. He suddenly said something to the young woman in a stern voice, and the young woman's expression immediately paled. She lowered her head silently, no longer daring to look towards Han Li's direction. That man did not let the matter go, and stared at Han Li with a malicious gaze. Han Li wrinkled his brow. It seemed the days that the girl spent at Spirit Beast Mountain had been harsh. This fully bearded man was actually one of the vicious characters he had taken note of a moment ago, one of the disciples with a cultivation at the 13th layer. This young woman was being so carefully watched by him. It was certain she had suffered quite a bit. However, Han Li was not a person from Spirit Beast Mountain. Furthermore, once they were in the forbidden area, those who weren't enemies at the moment would become enemies. He naturally did not respond to the provocation and paid no attention to the grimace aimed at him. Han Li's action angered the bearded man until his face flowed with blood. However, he had no method to grab Han Li, and with no better option, he turned his head to the young woman and roared several words in a low voice, provoking the nearby Spirit Beast Mountain disciples until they raised their eyebrows. Most of them glanced at the young woman with a look of hatred. Han Li grew sullen and felt much pity toward the young woman. However, because he was separated by such a long distance, he was unable to clearly hear what the bearded man was saying. Because he did not want to wrong this young woman again, Han Li no longer incited this boor who knew no manners toward women. Though Han Li was confident that he had sufficient methods to cause this person to seethe with anger without being able to retaliate. At this moment, each of the sect's martial ancestor finished their talks and returned to their sect's disciples. They then brought their juniors into the air, flying toward the famed forbidden area. After flying for several hours toward the border of the state of Yuanwu, they fell onto an expansive yellow earth slope that had no end. Apart from a pile of stones, not a single blade of grass could be seen. There was only a vast, endless yellow as far as the eye could see. Could it be here? Han Li and the others felt greatly surprised. This truly did not look like a place where spiritual objects of heaven and earth were nurtured. Several of the core formation experts gathered again to say a few words. Then a tall and sturdy expert from the giant sword sect suddenly walked out alone. After he walked forward about 10 steps, he stopped. He extended his left hand, and yellow light surged forth from the floor. It was as if a yellow dragon sprung forth from the mud and condensed into a giant mud sword in his hand. With a finger from his right hand, he softly stroked the sword from the handle to its point. A bright white light shined along his finger, making the mud sword gray in an instant, turning it into a giant heavy stone sword. This skill of turning mud into stone was a mid-grade magic technique, causing the disciples of the 7 sects to be astonished and widely opening their horizons. After this was done, the expert from the giant sword sect did not stop. Instead, he felt the sword in both hands and lowered his body. With a large shout, he threw the stone sword as fast as a meteor, sharply launching straight into the sky. This event shook the hearts of those who were present. When the stone sword barely flew the distance of several tens of steps, it immediately touched something. After a sudden tremor, it turned to fine dust, and an azure light covered the great expanse of the sky, causing everybody's skin to shine with an azure glow. While the crowd of disciples was scared witless, the azure light intensely surged for no reason, causing countless wind blades to scream out. They madly flew out everywhere, creating a wall of wind blades that neither wind nor rain could penetrate. The wind wall had no end to either side, and nobody knew where it ended. The azure light let out the hisses of wind from all directions. If someone were to enter the wall, they would immediately know the feeling of death from 1,000 cuts and turn into tens of thousands of pieces. This restrictive barrier is truly astonishing, and yet nobody knows what kind of remarkable ancient expert was able to set up such a tremendously ferocious spell formation. In comparison, Yellow Maple Valley's protective formations are like that of a child playing around. It's not worth mentioning, Hanley thought, inwardly sighing. At this moment, the giant sword sex expert shook his head and walked back. The remaining leaders declared that the time had yet to come and told the disciples to first rest for a short time. They would open the forbidden area in a moment. Like that, the person from the giant sword sect did the same thing every 2 hours to test the strength of the restrictive barrier. When the fourth stone word was thrown, the amount of wind blades rushing forth from the azure light clearly decreased by a great amount. With these circumstances, the 6 other core formation experts took the same actions and flew out shoulder to shoulder. Martial Ancestor Lee held out his hand. A ring-shaped object about a foot long slowly emerged from his palm, releasing a fierce silver radiance. The Taoist priest patted the back of his head and spouted out an inch-long azure light from his mouth. As it flew down the wind, it lengthened, transforming into a flying sword several feet long. The other 5 respectively let out extremely dazzling items: a pink ribbon, a dragon-like walking stick, a huge black-green sword, a long saber emitting red light, an official seal flickering with yellow light. The 7 items from the 7 people enhanced each other's brilliance, creating the appearance of a ring that charged directly into the great formation of wind blades. These were the magic treasures that these experts created after years of bitter temperament, once they entered core formation. Each of the sect's disciples didn't dare to be negligent. Under the orders of their foundation establishment seniors, they all stood behind the 7 ancestors in 7 columns, preparing to enter the forbidden area at any time. A burst of loud rumbling sounded out as the 7 magic treasures fiercely fought against the wind blades. All sorts of rays of light shot off in every direction, producing a strange whistle from time to time that caused the disciples who were watching to become very nervous. Martial Ancestor Lee's foot-long ring spun and revolved continuously, releasing silver lights that at some moments seemed large and other times seemed small, as if it were communicating with spirits. Countless wind blades struck against it. The azure flying sword transformed into a flood dragon more than 30 meters long. Each of the sword strikes carried a strange cry that astonished one's soul. The other 5 magic treasures were also remarkable, especially that Mei Tian's yellow seal. It was the most powerful. Each time it crushed down, it was as if a small mountain arose with the sound of thunder bursting out. However, after each attack, it withdrew and returned to its original form. Furthermore, its flight was slow and clumsy. Although the might of the 7 magic treasures were astonishing, and the large formation wind blades considerably weakened, it was still incomparably strenuous. Every step toward the wind wall required a great amount of effort. Before long, faint traces of sweat could be seen on the foreheads of these 7 experts. After 6 to 8 hours of fierce fighting, the 7 experts were sweating profusely. However, their magic treasures were finally winning, and they were able to beat open a passage in the wind wall about 3 meters wide. Nobody could see what existed beyond the passage. "Quickly enter. We won't be able to endure for long," the Taoist priest took the initiative to yell. Because he had the weakest magic power among the 7, he was also sweating the most. When the disciples of the 7 sects heard this, they dared not be negligent and flew into the passage in alternating turns. At that moment, everyone was silent with dark expressions. They all know that once they entered the forbidden area, everyone would immediately become an enemy of life or death. Even fellow apprentices from the same sect could not be trusted. Han Li stood in the middle rear of the column formations. In front of him was a giant sword sect disciple, and behind him stood a disciple from the saber transformation dock. The passage was not long, simply a distance of 60 meters away. In the instant Han Li flew out of the exit, the scene before him caused him to feel a moment of dizziness. Before his very eyes, the people behind him and the exit had disappeared without a trace. Chapter 180, Black Dragon Pond. The dark gray rotting earth was dotted with continuously bubbling muddy puddles, grotesque and twisted trees, and an unknown short blood-red grass beneath his legs. The air was filled with a strange, pungent odor. This was what Han Li observed once he grew clear-headed. Han Li could not help but be curious towards the bizarre environment. Han Li first diligently looked in all directions to see whether or not there were people around him. After all, the greatest source of danger were the sect disciples that entered the forbidden area along with him. It seemed that he was quite lucky. Within about 100 meters, there was no one aside from himself. He softly let out a sigh. However, he did not yet relax his guard, but rather held onto a talisman with one hand and the gold beetle swarm blades, with the other so that he would be absolutely safe. At that moment, Han Li was able to slightly calm himself. He carefully observed his surroundings for anything strange. Han Li was not frightened from having suddenly appeared in an unfamiliar area. Before the trip to the forbidden area, those stewards had given everyone detailed information concerning the forbidden area. The information mentioned that once someone entered the forbidden area, they would be affected by some shifting formation spell and be instantly transported to some corner in the forbidden area. As for what location, that would depend on the individual's luck. If one was able to be transferred to the area closest to the center, they would be able to gather many spiritual herbs. These figures would be the greatly fortunate ones. One could also be delivered directly beneath the stairs of several demonic beasts. If that were the case, there wouldn't even be a bloody battle. They would be fundamentally incapable of escaping with their body intact. As for those with even worse bad luck, they might be delivered to some dangerous area and would immediately die. Naturally, these sort of circumstances were minimal. The circumstances that occurred the most were those like Han Li, transported to some corner of the forbidden area and only able to blindly move forward. The reason why those circumstances occurred, according to the deduction of those senior experts, was because of the manner by which they broke the barrier and entered. Since they used an improper method to enter, it was only natural they would activate a few restrictions and encounter a few mishaps. While Han Li cautiously paced the vicinity in a circle, he compared the nearby environment with the information he had memorized. He eventually remembered some very useful information accumulated by the disciples who left the forbidden area. It was vastly useful to those who entered for the first time. The Black Dragon Pond is located in the forbidden area's northeast corner. The pond is about 100 meters deep at its center, with a radius of over 10 li. There are many rotting bone flowers, serpent slug trees, and other similar plants that can be used to create poison, but their value is not much. At the center of the Black Dragon Pond, every tens of years or so, a few clumps of cold smoke grass appear near the pond water. This is a wondrous herb that can be used in an extensive number of applications. If possible, gather as many as possible since the sect is sure to exchange great rewards for them. However, one must pay attention to the pool's depths as it may conceal a group of lower grade 1 demonic beasts, the cold ice toads. However, they have a meek nature. So long as one does not take the initiative to provoke them, they will not pose much danger. After Han Li went over the information several more times, he had several thoughts in mind. According to common conventions, the closer one was to the center of the forbidden area. The rarer spiritual items one would find along with stronger demonic beasts guarding them. The Black Dragon Pond was located near the outer edges but not in the outermost layer. If he hurried, he would be able to reach the innermost region within a day. With this thought, Han Li didn't dare to use flying tools. Instead, he jumped up a large, lush tree and surveyed in every direction. After he clearly identified the direction, he jumped down. The pool was south of Han Li and happened to lead towards the forbidden area's central area. It seemed he would be able to take a look in passing. Han Li used a concealment technique on his body. Afterwards, he carefully walked forward on the path with quick and light footsteps. It was unknown if it was because Han Li was excessively nervous, but after walking several li on the path, he had yet to encounter anything unexpected. It seemed he was the only person in the Black Dragon Pond area. When he heard the sound of flowing water, Han Li was able to slightly relax his tense mind. After chopping down winding branches that obstructed his path, he was able to see a deep dark green pond. Nobody had yet to approach it. The forest's chilling air already caused Han Li to shiver. This is the Black Dragon Pond. Han Li curiously sized it up. The size of the pool could not be considered large, and its surrounding area was filled with serpent slug trees. However, the surface of the water actually emitted traces of cold chi that could be seen with the naked eye. Even the land next to the pond produced a layer of sparkling ice. The intensity of the pond water's icy coldness could clearly be seen. And Li did not pay attention to these few things. What he cared about were the tens of bundles of the short white fluffy grass growing close to the water's edge. The grass stalks had 5 leaves and were a pure white all over. They also emitted a faint white chi that enveloped them like smoke. They truly seemed to have a somewhat spiritual appearance. That's right, this must be the cold smoke grass. It doesn't differ in the slightest from the information's description. Han Li muttered to himself, inwardly rejoicing. Although this herb had no relation to his foundation establishment pills, him being able to easily acquire this from the start was truly a good omen. Han Li habitually swept his gaze left and right before walking over. However, his expression suddenly changed. He lowered his body, lightly taking a few steps. After he concealed himself behind a few branches, he expressionlessly looked toward the left side of the dense woods. Not long after, the silhouette of a person flashed by. A blue-clothed man walked out while looking around. From the look of his clothes, he seems to be someone from the heavenly imperial fortress. This person was extremely careful. With each step, he turned his head 3 times and incessantly looked in all directions. It seemed he was firmly holding something in his fist. He should have already made preparations for an attack. He walked toward the direction of the cold smoke grass. Han Li sighed. It seemed he would have to retreat without results. Since the opponent was this cautious, Han Li wouldn't be able to succeed in a sneak attack against him. He did not intend to have a large battle with this person, as braving great dangers for such non-essential items was far from worth it. Come out, I've already seen you, stop concealing yourself. About 10 steps away from the cold smoke grass, the blue-clothed man suddenly halted and turned around, loudly shouting those words. Han Li was frightened. He thought that he had not been careful and then left a trace. But immediately after, he could not help but coldly smile because, although this blue-clothed man had shouted out loudly, his eyes were looking from place to place. He was basically not looking toward Han Li's hiding spot but was rather spouting out falsehoods. Han Li happily smiled. He saw that after the blue-clothed man loudly shouted for a while longer, he went to pick the cold smoke grass with relief. The blue-clothed man thought he was clever, but this actually caused Han Li to hesitate in deciding whether or not he should take advantage of the other party's moment of carelessness to approach him from behind. Han Li's plan was not acted out, however. The blue-clothed man quickly picked 3 to 4 clumps of white grass with extremely quick movements. It seemed this person understood that long delays invited trouble. Han Li inwardly shook his head and decided to retreat. His primary objectives were the 3 main ingredients for the foundation establishment pills. Before he fulfilled his goal, it would be best to preserve as much of his strength as possible. With this thought, Han Li quietly drew away. When he withdrew more than 30 meters away, he felt at ease to hurriedly rush away and avoid meeting with that person after he finished plucking the medicine. But Han Li had yet to leave when a scream came from the direction of the pond. It seemed to be the death cry of that blue-clothed man. Han Li had a cold shiver. After a moment of hesitation, he grit his teeth and turned around. He had to fully understand what had happened so he could avoid falling to the same fate. When Han Li covertly returned to the vicinity of the pool, 2 ferocious-looking men appeared at the side of the pond. It seemed these brightly clothed men were from Spirit Beast Mountain. At this moment, they were happily digging through the storage pouch of the heavenly Imperial Fortress Disciple. At their side were over 10 large blue toads. The body of the blue-clothed man had over 10 large holes in it. He couldn't possibly be more dead. Senior Marshal Brother Yu, this plan was too clever. When we discovered this idiot, we didn't attack him from the front but instead hurried and hid near Black Dragon Pond. After scattering some beast-controlling powder on the water, the nest of cold ice toads obediently listened to us. Hee. I didn't expect a bit of noise would draw his attention and allow the demonic beasts to abruptly attack the fellow from behind. A great amount of icicles spouted out, immediately killing this idiot. He probably hadn't even thought he would have been killed by a group of low-level demonic beasts before he died. This fellow truly had quite a bit of wealth on him. Senior Marshal Brother, instead of grabbing the medicine, wouldn't it be better to hide here and wait for others to take the cold smoke grass as bait? After saying this with greed, The younger man firmly kicked the corpse of the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple. Fun fact: the Black Dragon. In Black Dragon Pond is the same Black Dragon, Wulong, in Oolong Tea. Chapter 181. A Fight to the Death in Rainbow Moths. Humph in your dreams. You aren't using your brain to think about it. Us two Marshall brothers were lucky enough to be transported together. We are already really lucky. At the very least, our chances of survival are much greater. Being able to get rid of this man was just luck. Do you believe I am patient enough to play the game of idly waiting for prey? Don't be scared of meeting ferocious men and have our teeth throb. Are we not already playing with our lives by entering this place? Besides, how could there be anyone in this damnable place? We should go to the center area as soon as possible and take advantage of the danger. This is the best plan. The older Spirit Mountain disciple was clearly the stronger of the two. He was also much more clever. While he was lecturing him, he was also vigilantly sweeping his eyes over the deep forest in every direction. Having seen this, Han Li grew even more careful and used his chi restraining technique to its utmost. He also held his breath, not daring to expose himself in the slightest. As for the stupid thought of taking them on by himself, Han Li didn't even think of it. There was no way he would do something so dumb. One of the two had magic power at the beginning of the 12th layer. The other was at the higher step of the 12th layer. If they were to join hands, he wouldn't just have little chance of success, he simply wouldn't be able to resist their great strength. Thus, Han Li could only stare blankly as the two gathered the very last of the cold smoke grass and set fire to the corpse of the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple. Lastly, the two men stored the cold ice toads into a red-colored storage bag and then disappeared to the other side of the dense forest. Just after the two departed, Han Li did not immediately walk out. Only after he waited for a moment did he reveal himself from the foliage. After he stood, he looked thoughtfully in the direction of the two people. It seemed it was more or less like he had thought. There were many like-minded people here. It was no wonder, since these were people who took the risk to participate in the trial by blood and fire. How many of them wouldn't think to go the center for those spiritual items of heaven and earth? It would be difficult to avoid battle. After all, spiritual items that reached maturity were truly limited. There were fundamentally not enough for each sect. Han Li's face darkened. He bitterly thought this while standing in place for a while. He had witnessed with his own eyes as the blue-clothed person, who was just as careful as himself, silently disappeared from this world. It was unknown how many similar events occurred throughout the forbidden area. This caused Han Li's confidence in fulfilling his objective to sway by no small amount. He truly did not know whether or not it was a good idea to go on this trip to the forbidden area. Perhaps if he had taken those 2 Foundation Establishment pills, he might have been able to reach Foundation Establishment and fundamentally not need brave this strange danger. Han Li felt discouraged and had a faint notion of retreating. After all, while continuing was easy to say, one's thoughts would be in turmoil with the shadow of death looming in their mind. After several hours, Han Li left the vicinity and advanced toward the center of the forbidden area. After a moment of contemplation, Han Li's reason won over. He knew that those recent thoughts of carefulness were only his own weakness looking for an excuse. Thus, he strengthened his mind and resumed walking on the path. Han Li did not follow behind the two and instead took a detour, indirectly advancing even though the two from Spirit Beast Mountain took the closest and fastest route. Han Li wasn't being paranoid. With his abilities, the opponents would be able to find him. In addition, he was also fearful of Spirit Beast Mountain's exceptional beast-controlling method. He did not know whether the opponent had any unusual methods of discovering a pursuer, but it would be best to maintain his distance. It should be known that he originally used the small cloudwing bird, which had minor human intelligence, to track and monitor specific individuals from a long distance. It could be assumed that Spirit Beast Mountain also had a similar controlling method. Their methods were certain to be even more crafty and covert. After all, they were cultivators. How could the methods of Jianghu possibly compare? With regards to the cloudwing bird, Han Li felt a bit of regret. When he entered Yellow Maple Valley, in order to prevent arousing attention, he released the bird into the Tai Yue mountain range, allowing it to freely move about. As a result, the bird frequently returned to look for its master Han Li, for its favorite food, the yellow chestnut pill. However, after a long period of time, it gradually returned fewer and fewer times. By the time Han Li realized his mistake, the bird had already become wild and had actually flown to some faraway land, never to be seen again. This caused Han Li much heartache, as it would have been of much use on this journey within the forbidden area. What Han Li did not know was that his decision to take a roundabout route truly allowed him to escape calamity. After the two disciples from Spirit Beast Mountain left the Black Dragon Pond, each of them released rainbow moths over a large area. These beautiful flying insects immediately scattered in every direction, densely spreading over an area of about 300 meters. The color of their bodies then gradually changed, slowly matching with its surroundings. The colors of their body blended in so well that they could not be easily seen without a careful examination. Furthermore, even if a few careful people discovered these moths, they would most likely believe them to be native to the forbidden area and not suspect them. Thus, these colorful moths became natural sentries for the two. So long as someone entered their range of awareness, they would immediately alert the two and allow them to plan a response in advance. These numerous insects formed a living alarm network. As alarms, they could be said to be flawless, an expert trick known to Spirit Beast Mountain disciples. Although disciples of their own sect would know of this beforehand, they would have no method of passing through the moths and mounting a sneak attack against the two. Actually, with regards to Han Li's decision at Black Dragon Pond, it could be considered a great fortune. Those two from Spirit Beast Mountain did not yet release the rainbow moths at the pond and only released them after leaving. Otherwise, Han Li would not have escaped their notice. This wasn't a matter of negligence or forgetfulness. The moths were naturally fearful of the cold. If the temperature was a bit too low, they would freeze and die one by one. It would be truly regretful for the two. This Black Dragon Pond's water was of a strange nature and possessed an incomparable coldness. All the land nearby the pool transformed into a winter-like terrain. Under these circumstances, how could they dare to release their rainbow moths, only to see them die? Han Li wasn't aware in the least that his actions had prevented calamity. He was currently standing below a strange cliff, speechlessly looking at two wretched corpses by his feet. One of the corpses wore black skin-tight clothes and had a tall and bulky stature with large palms. There was a thin, dark red line of blood across his neck. The eyes were still open with an expression of unwillingness. It seemed he died discontentedly. The body appeared to be that of a giant sword sect disciple. As for the other body, it was of medium stature and was badly mutilated. What was most significant was its face was not intact. There was a huge sword that was thrusted all the way through his head. He had been impaled to the floor with it while he was still alive, causing bits of brain and blood to flow on the ground. However, a strange transparent thread was coiled around the ring finger of his right hand. Underneath the sunlight, he saw a faint flicker. Han Li carefully studied the corpse of the giant sword sect disciple for a very long time. Then he suddenly lifted the corpse by the tip of its feet and looked toward the red line at the neck, giving the head a light kick. As a result, the large head immediately rolled to the side. He did not need to use much strength. This person had long been split in two. Han Li sighed and looked toward the other corpse. Although he didn't have a face, Han Li already knew his identity since the corpse wore yellow robes similar to his own. There couldn't be stronger proof. However, he did not know which of his Yellow Maple Valley martial brothers the corpse belonged to. He clearly understood that these two died killing each other. Han Li lifted his head and looked toward the cliff peak without moving. He had already reached a final conclusion. In his mind, he imagined most of what took place between the two. From all the marks, the giant sword sect disciple should have exceeded the power of Han Li's senior martial brother by an entire layer. The corpse of the yellow-clothed disciple was badly mutilated and was riddled with injuries. The unreconciled expression on the black-clothed person's head clearly explained this matter. Although the senior martial brother from his sect was in a disadvantageous position, it was clear this person loved scheming. The only magic tool he used was actually that transparent thread. He definitely made use of his enemy's careless attitude as he was about to win. At the very last moment, he used this item to launch a sneak attack, severing his opponent's head and killing the giant sword sect disciple. However, he clearly didn't expect that the black-clothed man had enough strength left to launch his sword before he died. It was unknown whether the Yellow Maple Valley disciple was either too wounded to avoid the strike or if he had made a mistake on the verge of victory. But in the end he was impaled, resulting in a battle without a victor. Chapter 182, A Young Woman and Thread. Since it was clear how these two had died, Han Li could only pray that his senior martial brother had a pleasant journey to the Yellow Springs and would reincarnate soon. Then, with no trace of politeness, he plundered their bodies. TL, the Yellow Springs is part of the Chinese underworld. In any case, these people were already dead. Han Li would naturally kindly accepted their storage pouches. After a search once through, he couldn't find them. His expression became grave as he carefully searched through them once more, but he still could not find them. Han Li felt the hair on his body grow cold and stiff. His heartbeat started to accelerate. There was actually a fourth person here. It was this person who took away their storage pouches. Although this person had most likely long departed from this place, he could not guarantee that this person was not observing nearby, using these two corpses as bait and waiting for him to make a mistake. Facing away from the cliff, there was a large area of grass, tall enough to hide a man. Han Li was currently half squatting near the corpses with his back facing the grass. This caused him to be greatly worried. There might be someone hiding behind him. Han Li didn't move and remained in a squatting position. From behind, it would appear he was still focused on the corpses. However, he had already quietly taken out magic tools and talismans, and used the entirety of his consciousness to silently release his spiritual sense, attempting to find the person who might be hiding there. The outcome of his spiritual sense search did not surprise Han Li. Everything nearby was normal, and there were no unusual fluctuations of spiritual qi. With nothing being out of the ordinary, there must definitely be someone nearby. This person must be using the restraining breath technique to hide their body's magic power, making Han Li naturally unable to find them. The reason why Han Li searched with his spiritual sense was to beat the grass and scare the snake. TL, beating the grass to scare the snake, alerting the enemy as to intimidate or scare them. At the very least, the opponent who existed in his thoughts wouldn't dare to act blindly. The outcomes he truly expected was either that he had scared himself with groundless fears and there was nobody here, or the person who had restrained their breath this entire time and was spying on him would see no opportunity to take advantage of him and therefore would not plan to act. After a moment, Han Li stood and turned around to the large area of tall grass. After he sized up the area several times with a cold glance, he suddenly leapt away without saying a word, transforming into a black dot as he gradually grew farther away. When Han Li's figure had completely disappeared without a trace, rustling suddenly came from within the originally peaceful tall grass. A slim figure walked out. It was actually a young girl with fluttering white clothes. This girl appeared young, only about 15 to 16 years old. However, her appearance was pure and her face appeared innocent and adorable. In this place of life and death, such a fairy-like charmer had appeared. It was truly hard to believe. From the look of her clothes, she should be affiliated with the masked moon sect. The young woman looked the direction Han Li disappeared and smiled with pursed lips. With a voice overflowing with age, she said to herself, "Your bravery and wisdom isn't bad. It's your magic power that's a bit lacking. It seems there is also a large problem with your aptitude. There isn't much potential that can be drawn out. If not for that, you would have surely been one of those who would make it out alive." Regardless, the technique he used to run away seemed to be Qigong from the mortal world. Furthermore, it wasn't weak, and was actually truly interesting. The young woman lightly raised her sharp chin with opened eyes, showing an expression of considerable interest. If Han Li had heard those words, he would only be stunned with fear. Her words were far too accurate. With just a few words, she was able to sinisterly point out his strengths and weaknesses as if she understood him more than himself. "I'll let you go for now. I'm still preoccupied with other business. However, the next time I see you, young fellow, I won't let you off so easily," the young woman said with a bit of unwillingness as she wrinkled her nose, creating a mischievous crease. It was as if Han Li had become her newly acquired toy. She was greatly interested in him, causing her to regret having to leave. In the end, the young woman pouted with her small mouth and took out a talisman. With a wave of her hand, she was enveloped in dazzling green light and disappeared. If there was someone present who had saw that scene, they would perhaps immediately feel heartache and loudly curse this woman's clan, hoping it would wither. She actually squandered a talisman that was rarely seen in the cultivation world, a wood evasion technique talisman, as she pleased. That was an elementary mid-grade talisman. It should be known that if an average person had this wood evasion talisman, although it wasn't enough to be a family heirloom, it was something that could only be used in a matter of life or death, since its most optimal use was to escape death. Han Li did not know any of this, so he naturally felt no heartache. Even more so, he couldn't have known that there was a woman who was greatly interested in him and thought about him often. He still believed that he had lightly escaped from a predicament and was currently rejoicing. Regardless of whether or not there was truly someone there, Han Li did not intend to look into it further. After all, the closer he approached the central area, the more common enemies would become. They would set up similar ambushes, and attacking others would gradually become a common occurrence. To preserve his own life, he must spare no effort to avoid all sorts of unnecessary conflict. That was Han Li's current plan of operation. Besides, it wasn't as if Han Li gained nothing from those two corpses. With this thought, Han Li held out his hand. There was a ball of transparent thread in his palm. As he departed, he picked up that item in passing. It was the thread-like magic tool that had been used to kill the giant sword sect disciple. Han Li poured a bit of magic power into the magic tool, which gradually became taut and straight. In the end, it unexpectedly became a perfectly straight thread over 30 meters long. Han Li controlled and waved the thread as he wished for a moment, and he immediately felt that this item had clever uses. After he was finished, he truly thought this was the perfect weapon for an ambush. Because of its near-invisible properties and its incomparably sharp and completely flexible cuts, Han Li could confidently behead his opponents without them even knowing. He truly did not know what material was used to refine this thread. If it was able to become even longer, then there would be countless clever uses. Han Li's mood grew as he willed the thread through more than 10 large nearby trees. All of them were cut in two without the slightest resistance. This caused Han Li to be greatly happy as even more uses began to grow in his mind. Han Li did not know that at this time, near the center of the forbidden area, the disciples of Saber Transformation Doc and the Clear Void sect were engaged face-to-face in close combat. Because each party had 5 to 6 people, their strength was about the same, making them evenly matched. This was the first large-scale deathmatch in the current trial by blood and fire. The reason was so that they would be the first to enter the central area and pick the spiritual medicines. If they were able to extinguish their opponents here, then naturally they would take advantage of their good fortune. The final outcome was that the skills employed by the Taoist priests from the Clear Void sect were a notch higher. After they killed the majority of their opponents, the remaining 2 from the Saber Transformation Doc fled with injuries. The Clear Void sect disciples then took the initiative to enter the central area. Within the central area, not only would there be many wondrous flowers, bizarre fruits, and other spiritual items of heaven and earth, there would also be strong grade 1 demonic beasts guarding those items, powerful enough to go head-to-head against Peak Foundation establishment disciples. Every time a demonic beast was killed and the medicine was collected, so long as more spiritual medicines grew, demonic beasts would also indescribably appear, although it wouldn't necessarily be the same kind of demonic beast. This already puzzled the sects, many experts to no end. Could it be the demonic beasts were also born spontaneously from the spiritual chi of heaven and earth? This vastly differed from their previous understanding. According to their knowledge, demonic beasts should be formed from living wild animals. Only after subconsciously absorbing the essence of the sun and moon for many years would they be able to occasionally evolve into a demonic beast. The probability of animals evolving was not at all like that of developing cultivators among humans. The animals' odds were far greater. Furthermore, over the years, each of the sects' disciples were only able to gather spiritual medicines on the outskirts of the central area. If they were to approach closer to the center, they would encounter a few restriction spell and traps, becoming trapped or erased. In addition, the further they entered, the more formidable the demonic beasts became. Since the disciples were minor figures with no method to resist, they could only obediently pace back and forth at the outskirts of the central area. Regardless if it were Clear Void sect disciples, not even those who made the first move would be able to take advantage and take the medicines there. At this moment, Han Li had come across the greatest crisis on his trip within the forbidden area. At some narrow road, there was a spirit beast mountain and a heavenly imperial fortress disciple blocking both sides of the road. Han Li actually recognized the large man from Spirit Beast Mountain. He was that fully bearded man who had been staring at him earlier. Currently, he was looking at Han Li with an evil smile, exposing a "you're already dead" expression. Chapter 183, Harmonic Spiritual Talisman. Chapter 183, Harmonic Spiritual Talisman. Han Li tasted some bitterness from his mouth. He did not think that as greatly careful and tremendously cautious as he would still be ambushed. Furthermore, it was one of the worst possible circumstances between 2 people. Currently, he was in a zone called the Skyline. Its environment was extremely dangerous. If one did not use flying magic tools, the entire region only had a narrow small path that led to the central area. Lining the two sides of the small path were incomparably steep cliffs. Although Han Li was not weak in the light body martial arts of the mortal world, he would not dare to rashly climb them. As for flying directly over with flying magic tools, the idea was even more absurd. It would be a suicidal action, openly allowing others to launch an attack. Why even think of it? None of the sect's disciples would ever perform such folly. Furthermore, the bitter experiences of his predecessors taught him that flying was an absolutely prohibited action in the forbidden area, else one would leave a corpse. When Han Li entered the vicinity, he hesitated for quite a while. However, he ultimately didn't dare to take the shortcut by flying over the mountain peak. As a result, he was forced to openly follow the small road on foot. Naturally, Han Li was completely wary of the dangers in this area. On the entire way, his nerves were tightly strung. But even so, just when he had walked through the path opening, his path was blocked from the front and back by two people without even the slightest warning. When Han Li saw the bearded man's fierce expression, he knew that to talk arrogantly at this moment was of no use at all. First, he slapped the defensive water barrier talisman on his body, and then he brought out the flying dark iron shield. Additionally, he took out the magic tool, gold beetle swarm blades, and his few elementary high-grade earth prison technique talismans. The fully bearded man and the person behind him looked at Han Li's actions with cold eyes, without the slightest intention of stopping or attacking him. It seemed the two were completely confident. They felt entirely certain that they could handle Han Li and appeared calm. This was no surprise. The person behind him was already at the peak of the 12th layer. Not to mention the fully bearded man had already cultivated to the 13th layer. Facing an 11th layer fledgling such as Han Li, they naturally felt that it would be a trivial matter. When Han Li saw this, he licked his dry lips and inwardly sneered to himself. Since his opponents were so negligent, he would naturally exploit this opportunity. Thus, remaining completely calm, Han Li faced his body to the side so that his enemies were to his right and left, as if they were horns, to avoid being attacked in the back. As expected, these two did not take the opportunity to attack jointly. These were the strongest enemies he had ever faced since he entered the world of cultivation. Even so, Han Li wasn't fearful of them in the least. Although he did his utmost to avoid fighting with others, it wasn't because he had no confidence in himself. Even though Han Li's magic power was greatly lacking and would be a disadvantage in a battle of attrition, the top-quality magic tools and the treasure talisman he possessed were enough to make up for this deficiency. Furthermore, if it truly did not work out, he could take out the Heaven's Lightning Child and eliminate a person. Was that not an easy matter? But whether or not he was willing to use it was an entirely different matter. However, Han Li had a bit of doubt. Why would the fully bearded man and the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple not fight one another and instead team up? If they were disciples from the same sect, it would be an ordinary matter. However, these two were obviously not from the same sect. Boy, your courage isn't small. Outside the forbidden area, you actually dared to mock me and exchange flirting glances with that SL_T. Now I will take your life as an apology, the fully bearded man said fiendishly. Then he turned to the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple and said, "Brother Yan, I have a grudge against this fellow. Hand this person over to me. I want to treat him properly and let him know that you can't be so reckless in the cultivation world. Before you offend someone in your next life, first remember this before you speak." When the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple heard this, he shrugged his shoulders without care and said, "Do as you like. I'll just stand to the side. However, don't be like last time and throw him off the edge. Otherwise, you'll owe me a life-saving favor." Haha, that time was a complete accident. This time I'm handling a fledgling. If I use half my strength, I'll have enough to spare. The fully bearded man's face was red, but soon after he slanted his mouth and said this with disdain. "Ki, you should do your best. I truly don't wish for there to be a day I hear of your death. After all, we've been good friends for many years. To find a person of agreeable temperament is truly difficult." The heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple shook his head. It seemed the fully bearded man's arrogance gave him great headaches, but he did not believe that the opponent before him posed any threat to his old friend. Besides, he was attentively watching from the side. At the side, Han Li did not shut out the two's dialogue and heard it clearly. From the words he heard, the doubts in his heart were cleared. Unexpectedly, these two were originally friends. Furthermore, their relationship was rather good. This was rather troublesome. These two were certain to coordinate together against enemies far better than common temporary alliances. Hearing their words, It seemed they had cooperated on more than one occasion. And Li couldn't help but feel greatly depressed. It seems I can only use the lightning child, but first it's important that I dispose of one of them. Then I will be able to handle the remaining one much more easily. However, this is too strange. Originally, each sect's disciples were randomly transported. How could they happen to be transported to the same area and happen to meet? This is truly incredible, Han Li hatefully thought. He felt greatly indignant toward their luck. And Li did not know that the heavenly imperial fortress disciple had also joyfully thought this in his heart. When this person saw the fully bearded man walk toward Han Li, his mind couldn't help but think that he was able to meet his good friend due to the great work of the harmonic spiritual talisman. High-grade harmonic spiritual talisman. This item is truly useful. So long as we enter the forbidden area during the same moment and use the talisman at the same time, our spiritual chi will temporarily bind together, and the restriction formation will transport us to the same area. Although I heard the odds of success is 50%, the price of the talisman was exceptionally more expensive than ordinary elementary high-grade talismans. But in the end, we were able to wait in that location and successfully ambush several disciples who passed through. It was a great harvest. Besides, I am not foolish. Spending such a large price to brave the strange dangers of the forbidden area, was it not in order to openly kill and plunder the many individuals who were covetously gazing at those spiritual medicines? There will be great harvests without any repercussions. This one is convinced that so long as us two join hands and don't come across those fierce experts, our objective will be easily and effortlessly accomplished. Then, when it is near the end, we will pull back and find a place to hide. We'll stay there until it's time and safely leave. This is truly a flawless plan. Only I could have thought of it. The heavenly imperial fortress disciple thought of his future prospects after he left and could not help but think beautiful narcissistic thoughts. His mind naturally did not think of the great battle that was about to occur. At this moment, the fully bearded man took out a green leather pouch and sent Han Li an evil grin as he approached. It seemed he wanted to dispose of him. However, it was unknown if it was because of his good friend's warning, but he used a talisman halfway. He became covered in a green-colored light barrier that increased his defense. Seeing these circumstances, Han Li wrinkled his brow. He had a bit of a headache. He was originally going to act fearful of the Spirit Beast Mountain disciples' actions and prepare to make use of this person's negligence, getting rid of this person first. But now that his opponent released a defensive magic technique, this was no longer something he could do in a short amount of time. Naturally, if he used Heaven's Lightning Child, this person wouldn't be able to do anything even if he had other methods. However, this was a one-time use consumable. If it wasn't a crucial moment of life or death, Han Li would not use it. Since using it was out of the question, Han Li naturally planned to attack the heavenly imperial fortress disciple instead. He saw that the person had both hands behind his back with his head raised to the sky. He was currently pondering about something, not taking note of anything happening at all. Han Li was exalted. He knew there was an opportunity to exploit. Without taking the time to think, he used the earth prison technique, talisman in his hand, throwing it toward the fully bearded man. As a result, the talisman turned into a stream of yellow light in midair, fiercely shooting toward his opponent. It actually covered the barrier of the fully bearded man's defensive magic technique. It took the shape of a larger yellow barrier and firmly trapped him within, not allowing him to move an inch forward. Chapter 184, Might of the Golden Light Brick. When the fully bearded man saw Han Li with his hand still on the talisman, he was not worried. The wood attribute defensive barrier he wore had frightening defensive power that could fundamentally ignore common attacks. Furthermore, on the basis that his opponent was a novice who cultivated to the 11th layer, he didn't believe that he could possess a talisman of great strength. At most, it would be an elementary mid-grade talisman. Because of this, he continued to walk forward without taking notice, opening his pouch as if he were about to bring something out. But when he was suddenly rooted in place by the yellow light barrier which he recognized as the earth prison technique, the fully bearded man's expression finally changed, realizing that things had taken a turn for the worse. At this time, a strange dark green snake with a pair of purple wings leapt out from his pouch. As soon as it appeared, the snake immediately made a few odd gwa-gwa cries and began to viciously attack the yellow barrier, causing the barrier to tremble continuously. Its strength was not small. When the fully bearded man saw this, his spirits were slightly lifted. He took out another pouch to release another spirit beast, hoping to combine their efforts to break through the earth prison. He was confident that he would be able to escape in a short period of time. When he escaped, he would definitely pull out his opponent's ribs one by one to quench the hatred in his heart. And Li didn't even pay attention to his surrounding enemies. In a swift movement, he rushed towards the man from the heavenly imperial fortress. His movements were quick, and throughout the whole way, he seemed to be darting in and out of view, even leaving behind a series of afterimages, making him seem almost phantom-like. At the same time, Han Li gently patted the storage pouch near his waist. The original gold beetle swarm blades suddenly switched with another similarly small magic tool that he clutched tightly in his hand. At this time, the man from the heavenly imperial fortress finally awoke from his beautiful dream, instantly seeing the strange scene unfolding in front of him. His expression changed dramatically. He hurriedly backed up and flipped his palm, causing a talisman to appear. Meanwhile, Han Li was still at least 30 meters away from him. The man relaxed, thinking that there was more than enough time to cast the talisman. However, before he was able to use his spiritual power to activate the talisman, he was stunned to see that the charging Han Li suddenly smiled mysteriously at him. In turn, one of Han Li's hands gently waved at him, a movement similar to a greeting between two familiar friends. At the same time, he also felt a slight itch on his neck, as if he had been bitten by a mosquito. The man from the heavenly imperial fortress stared blankly, yet to realize the other side's intention. In a moment of turmoil, his eyes dimmed as he lost consciousness. Brother Yan. Standing off to the side, the fully bearded man from Spirit Beast Mountain involuntarily cried out with wide eyes, having seen the whole thing clearly. He personally saw that Han Li was able to kill his close friend with a simple wave of his hand from about 3 meters away. His friend's head rolled on the ground with a goo-loo-loo sound, separated from its body. However, the now headless body continued to back up a few steps until it fell over on the ground, blood spurting from its neck about a few feet high with hoo-hoo sounds. The fully bearded man suddenly felt his hands and feet turn ice cold with a cold sweat down his back. The methods the opponent used to kill his friend were too demonic. He had seen clearly that his friend was killed without contact, and the opponent for sure hadn't used any kind of magic technique. Boy, as soon as I get out I will hack you to pieces. Although he felt beads of cold sweat exuding from his forehead and was filled with grief for his friend, the fully bearded man maintained a menacing attitude to strengthen his courage, bracing himself and standing firm. In actuality, however, he had decided in his heart that as soon as he escaped from the earth prison technique, he would immediately run far away, biding his time. Revenge was a dish best served cold after all. The boy in front of him was too strange. Not only did he have the high-grade earth prison technique talisman, but he also could kill people with invisible weapons, making him truly difficult to deal with. Getting revenge for his friend is indeed important, but first he must preserve his own life. It turned out that the seemingly ferocious fully bearded man was actually a person as cowardly as a mouse that bullied the weak yet feared the strong. Most people would be surprised by this. Of course, Han Li had no way of knowing his opponent's thoughts. All he saw was that the opponent had released another pangolin-like beast that, along with that strange snake, had begun to fiercely attack the yellow barrier. The fully bearded man had also taken out a pair of iron rod-like magic tools to aid the two beasts in smashing the barrier, causing it to flicker with light incessantly. The earth prison technique could not be maintained for much longer. As soon as Han Li realized this, he took out his golden light brick, treasure talisman with one hand, bringing it in front of his eyes and staring at it intently in order to activate it. If he were to use any other normal magic tool, he simply could not feel at ease. His opponent, after all, was a 13th layer expert. If he was unable to kill him with one blow, there would be big trouble when his opponent escaped. Until now, he still remembered the exhausting battle with Senior Marshal Brother Liu, and at that time, Senior Marshal Brother Liu had only been at the 12th layer. Despite this, he had not expected that he could actually use the transparent thread to finish off a 12th layer opponent. However, the fully bearded man was already on guard and would not be defeated so easily. A fully bearded man under the earth prison technique, seeing the weird movements of the talisman in Han Li's hands, felt his heart tense. He tightened his grip on the pair of black iron cudgels, but the yellow barrier of the earth prison technique was extremely strong. Even if it had changed shape and darkened to the point of being in danger of fracturing, it continued to maintain its integrity. Upon seeing this, the fully bearded man became so angry that he almost vomited blood. At this time, he suddenly felt a gust of an astonishing amount of spirit power rocketing up from Han Li's direction. He couldn't help but slowly turn his body and look in his direction. He saw Han Li's hand emitting a strong golden light, and a lustrous, shining golden rectangular object slowly rose up, floating in midair. Treasure talisman. The fully bearded man's expression changed dramatically, and he began to yell in terror. He had realized the nature of the golden light brick. What he didn't know, however, was that Han Li's face at this moment was also deathly pale with alarm. The floating object was furiously draining all of his inner magic power steadily, without any way of stopping it. It seemed as if it would suck him dry. The quietly complaining Han Li, as he was suffering, began to curse the store that had sold him this item. How is this a treasure talisman? It's clearly a leech that wants to kill me. However, when a third of his magic power had been drained, the treasure talisman finally stopped its wild movements and calmed down. Control over it once again returned to Han Li. At this time, Han Li did not hesitate and pointed, causing the golden light brick treasure talisman to immediately shoot out. It flew straight towards the fully bearded man, who was still trapped under the earth prison technique. His face became ashen from fright. The golden brick began to expand, and in the blink of an eye it became as large as a room. Spiritual chi revolved around it and radiated golden light in all directions. Its pressure was truly astonishing. When it reached the fully bearded man's forehead, the golden brick was like a small mountain in size, and it came down with a violent clap. Peng! After the loud sound and fully bearded man's blood-curdling scream, the entire earth shook violently. Han Li was both surprised and happy. His expression was somewhat strange. Was it really possible to eliminate a 13th layer disciple that easily? Han Li had some doubts. As soon as he retrieved the treasure talisman, the golden light brick immediately returned to its original form and flew back into Han Li's hand. An extremely large crater had formed in the place where the golden brick had slammed into the ground, almost 30 meters wide and a meter deep. As for the fully bearded man and his spirit beasts, they had become a pile of mud, indistinguishable from one another. The fully bearded man really had been killed. Han Li was at a loss. It was as if he couldn't resist a single strike in the slightest. Was it that the fully bearded man was too weak, or that the golden light brick was simply too strong? Han Li was unable to decide. However, after generating such a loud noise, it was no longer safe to stay in this place. Han Li quickly became sober. After he destroyed the two corpses, he took the 5 or 6 storage pouches and left the area, leaving the skyline. Continuing to walk forward would most likely have led to a large forest, which was incidentally also an ideal place to ambush and kill people. Perhaps after entering the forest, there would be another fierce battle waiting for him. Thus, before entering, he decided to find a place to rest a little and restore his magic power in order to protect himself. Chapter 185 The Strong. Chapter 185 The Strong. While Han Li was on the outer edges of the forest, he found a dense, large tree. When he jumped on top of the tree to recover his strength, the entire forbidden area had reached the first climax of the Trial of Blood and Fire's massacre. Various strong individuals revealed their fangs one by one and began to purge the nearby weaklings. The closer they were to the center of the area, the more frequent and bloody the massacres became. Of course, experts of equivalent strength would occasionally run into each other. They would look past the other person and reach a wordless, mutual understanding, simply brushing past one another. It was not time for them to do battle yet. With this said, of the many disciples from various sects in the forbidden area, the majority could be divided into 3 types of people. One kind were those who were extremely weak, people whose cultivation were only around the 11th or even 10th layer. They all had very different reasons for entering this forbidden area. If it wasn't because of hardships against their will, it was because they were forced, or it was because they were hopeful in their luck to take advantage of a crisis for their own gain. Regardless of their reasons, they were all part of the bloody massacre's lowest level, only able to play the role of being slaughtered. Often after the first day in this forbidden area, apart from a few people with the most clever and particular self-preservation methods, these weaklings were almost completely purged by others. Of course, people like Han Li could rely on strange treasures and fierce incisiveness, but he could be considered an exception. Second kind were those like the fully bearded man. Although their magic power was not weak, their self-regard and strength could not compare with the experts, and they were aware that to obtain a spiritual item was beyond hope. They were unwilling to battle with the highest layer experts inside the forbidden area for the spiritual herbs, instead turning their attention to the first type of people. They intended to use this opportunity to kill these people and steal their treasures, quietly becoming very rich. These kinds of people inside of the trial of blood and fire for the first 2 days were quite active. When the third day began, however, the remaining victors would automatically lie low in the forbidden area, refusing to reveal themselves anymore. This was because they were very clear that after the third day it was time for the experts to have showdowns with one another. If these middle-strength people ran into such an expert during this time, it would absolutely be a one-way trip to death. Of course, there were also a few who were either arrogant or did not have a grasp of their own strength and would charge directly into center of the battle for the spiritual medicines. Their bodies would never be found. However, most of the people grabbed opportunities early and withdrew quickly, and were often the most common type of person in the trial of blood and fire. In contrast, the strongest individuals would die tragically one by one, as if part of some kind of joke. Thus, the last type of people became the least common. These people were at the top of the pyramid, and they were the most elite disciples of the various sects that had entered the forbidden area. They were the ones that the various sects had placed their high hopes on. As for the other disciples of the same schools, they were at the most cannon fodder, meant to aid the plans of their various sects. This group was elite. Their magic power was profound, complemented by magic tools with astonishing power. They only had one goal, which was to kill all the disciples of other sects and steal away enough spiritual medicine. The extent of the first massacre at the start lay in their mutual, wordless understanding to first get rid of the trash and all those who were only there to take advantage of the situation. This was to prevent these people from obstructing their movements and, in general, any problems from sprouting up. In addition, the news that someone had been one step in front of them to the central area did not make them panic or become edgy. Entering it was easy, but if they wanted to bring spiritual medicine out, that would be incredibly difficult. The massacre continued to progress, but because Han Li was still a distance away from the central area, he was still not able to involve his recovered self. However, other weaker members were not as lucky as Han Li, and many were brought into the middle of the massacre even as they desperately struggled to free themselves to protect their own lives. And Saber Transformation Doc Su was one of these people. Today, Su-er's face was deathly pale, staring at the person in front of him with an expression of pure terror. This person was big and was carrying a giant silver sword. It was this person who had, right in front of Su-er, already killed the other two disciples from Saber Transformation Doc. Under his giant silver sword, it didn't matter what kind of high-grade weapon and protective armors were used. It was as if they couldn't even withstand one attack, being ripped apart one by one as if they were thin paper. They were inevitably sliced in two. However, it was because there were those two other disciples from the same sect that Su-er, seeing that the situation was far from good, seized the opportunity to slip away, falling into confusion as he ran. Unfortunately, the big man didn't seem to have the idea of letting him go, instead persistently chasing him for a few dozens of hours and finally catching up to him here. This caused him to thoroughly lose hope. "If you kill yourself, I can leave you an intact corpse," said the big guy expressionlessly and with a cold glare. You can go die." In the midst of his hopeless situation, Su-er, who knew that he would not live much longer, erupted in fighting spirit. He took the only two high-grade magic tools he had on him and in one breath threw them all out. "Idiot!" The big guy spoke this very deliberately. Next, the huge silver sword flew from his back into the air. As if without effort, the two magic tools were broken into pieces. In the same motion, Su-er was also cut into two pieces. After finishing all of this, the big guy did not even bother to look at Su-er's corpse. Instead, he spun on his heel and left without even the idea of moving towards the storage pouch. To him, the only magic tool he needed was the huge silver sword. Any other magic tool or precious item would only distract him and would be a big hindrance to his cultivation. At the same time, at a small brook near the central area, a female disciple of the Masked Moon sect controlled a magic tool like a scarf while drenched in sweat. She was currently bitterly defending herself from two red, shiny daggers, but it seemed as if at any moment she would be unable to defend herself any longer. "Could this senior martial brother wielding daggers please let this junior martial sister go? I'm willing to serve senior martial brother with my body tonight." Since this woman was at death's door and was past caring about shame, she used a woman's greatest advantage and tried to seduce him. But would it succeed? Based on their encounters and the tactics he had used, she had absolutely no idea. Fine, withdraw your magic tools and I'll agree. The person speaking was an 18 or 19-year-old male wearing a earthy-colored robe. He had delicate features, red cheeks and white teeth, all the characteristics of a delicate, handsome male. Having said this, he stopped his two daggers in midair and lightly smiled at the woman. The masked moon sect female was delighted and hurriedly gave him two winks. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly allowed the scarf to descend, retrieving it into her hand. Then she stuck her breasts out as if she was about to say something. Unfortunately, before she could open her lips, the handsome male's face suddenly expressed a killing intent. His finger violently pointed, and in a surprising turn of events, two red flying daggers immediately cut in a crisscross. The woman, without a whisper, fell to the ground, fresh blood puddling on the floor. SL_T. Even someone as common and unrefined as you thinks that they can seduce me, Han Tiania. Note the Han, used here is different from Han Li's surname. The handsome male's face bore an expression of disgust, his voice suddenly becoming intense. Next, he took out a pleasant-smelling handkerchief from his waist, delicately wiping the dust on his face. His movements were very gentle and reserved, as if he were an unmarried daughter of a noble household. I should hasten my journey. Perhaps there will be others along the road who will also provide some entertainment. After thinking this aloud, the male carelessly tossed the handkerchief he had used to wipe himself onto the female's face, leaving with a swagger. Deep in the forest, a disciple of the spirit beast mountain lay dead on the ground. A yellow-robed, middle-aged man stood nearby. He was currently shaking his head and staring at the sky, mumbling something to himself. Behind him were a few extremely fierce beasts lying on the ground, not moving without a breath. On top of the barren mountain, an ugly-faced, green-robed man was frantically controlling about a large swarm of huge bees, besieging a few people dressed like Taoists. Just like that, the strong massacring the weak could be found everywhere in the forbidden area. Although Han Li did not see all of this, he could faintly smell a bloody scent drifting through the air. However, he had no time to look into the whole story, instead sitting on the treetop without moving, gradually restoring the magic power in his body. The time passed by very quickly, and more than half of the first night in the forbidden area had already gone by. What shocked Han Li was that, in this area, the amount of extremely bright light was the same during both daytime and nighttime. The entire sky was always an overcast color, making people who saw it feel somewhat unsettled. When his magic power had been restored enough, and as Han Li was rejoicing quietly in his heart, the sound of hurried footsteps and heavy gasps suddenly came from far away, slowly getting closer. It was as if there was someone running towards the very tree that Han Li was meditating on.